The Birth of a Hero is a novel about a boy who travels to another dimension, the birth of countless heroes, and the clash between them. After escaping the dark forest, Choi Han, the main character of the story, discovers the warmth of humanity in the town of Harris and makes friends and family there. But one day, the town is destroyed by a mysterious organization. Though he possessed explosive strength and had spent decades in the dark forest, Choi Han was a pure and kind soul that could not bring himself to kill humans. But when Harris is ravaged, he commits his first murder. He rushed towards the man and kills him with his sword. The other guy says, "Who are you?" Then he runs towards him and other guy asks his men to kill him. He swings his sword and kills them all and they all cry in pain. Blood is everywhere, even on the vegetables lying in the basket. Then he is standing among their dead bodies huffing with pain on his face. Choi Han only comes back to his senses after slaughtering all the members of the mysterious organization. The fact that he failed to extract any information from them causes him to fall into a pit of despair. After taking a life for the first time, Choi Han learns the meaning of grief. Then he leaves Harris for the first time and goes to the city of Western, the heart of Hennetis country. As luck would have it, Kale the Lout meets Choi Han there and gets beaten to a pulp. A boy is looking himself at the mirror and says this is definitely Kale. He says that I woke up as Kale Hennetis in one day, even though all I did was fall asleep while reading The Birth of a Hero. While looking at mirror he says that am I posing his body? This isn't good, so I look like Kale now. He says that in the first book of the series, Kale is one of the minor villains that Choi Han outsmarts from time to time. He jumps into the water bathtub and says, well, this is not so bad. He says that I have no regrets, I am an orphan with no money. I don't have anyone I love, or friends I could die for. He keeps talking to himself and says I was only alive because I was not dead yet. So I have no regrets about leaving behind my life as Kim Raksu. I can't die like this. I don't want to die, or feel pain. After all, someone once said, better a living beggar than a buried emperor. He touches his body and says there is no scar, which means Kale hasn't met Choi Han yet. Kale Hennetis, the Lout of the Count's family. The scar on his side is from armbar fight he gets into before meeting Two Hands, all because of a bad tasting wine. He says what the ridiculous guy he is. While he keeps thinking, saying I don't know what happens to Kale after that. He says that all I know is that Choi Han grows into a hero after experiencing a series of strange events and overcoming many challenges. Kim, who had somehow turned into Kale, had one simple motto in life. The motto is, let's avoid getting beaten up. He stands up and say maybe I can skip that part of the story and move him along. He comes out of the tub and says that he want to live a long, healthy, happy, and uneventful life. While drying himself with a towel he says that good thing is this that at least he remember the first part of the story. While brushing his hair, he says that I think I can do this. While Kale is in bathroom, someone came and asks my lord, are you in the bathroom? Kale rustles wearing his clothes and replies yes, I'll be right out. As he steps out he is a little wet. The man smiles and says your water, my lord. He is Ron, a former assassin from the eastern continent, that came here by ship. Kale glimpses at him and thinks he acts kind, but no one can tell what he is really thinking. He snatches the glass and steps out thinking I'm going to toss this scary old man over to Joy Man first. While Ron smirks at him. Kale is sitting and tapping on the table. He thinks that I'm surrounded by powerful forces here. I mean, even my closest servant is an assassin. I need to be able to protect myself. The continent will be engulfed in war soon. He says that he need to prepare himself if he want that nice, long life. He is thinking that he can't become too stronger, or else people will take notice. While he is thinking, someone knocks at door and comes inside saying my lord, I am here to pick out a set of clothes for you. Kale tells him that he would like something simple today. He gives him a dress saying yes, my lord. He gets ready and is looking in the mirror and thinks, of course, anything would look great on this body. He says that my looks can really make or break an outfit. Then he starts moving and says let's go. While he is stepping into the dining hall all the servants bow down and greets him saying good morning, my lord. He starts thinking that is everyone afraid of him? He replies himself saying that sure Kale breaks a few things here and there when he gets drunk, but he never hurt anyone. He is just a reckless guy who drinks a lot. That is why he is known as a lout. While looking at those servants he thinks that, well, whatever, he preferred to be left alone anyway. Ron opens the door and says let me get the door for you, enjoy your breakfast. Clan thanks him and wishes him the same saying enjoy yours too. As he steps in everyone is sitting on the dining table. This is Kale's family. It is made up of his father Deruth Hennetis, the head of the household, his stepmother, Violin, his stepbrother Basson, and his stepsister Lily. The father tells him to have a seat while telling him that he is late. He drags the chair and sits. The count doesn't have any power or authority, but he does have some money, and the Countess and her children actively avoid Kale, which makes this the perfect place to live an ordinary life. Except they all stare a lot. The father asks him that is there something you would like to say. He replies no. While he starts eating, he is thinking that they all feel uncomfortable around him and he should quickly finish his food and get out of here. Looking at the food he thinks that this is a hell of a sausage. While he is enjoying his food and smiling, Besan is starting him. He is curious that Kale smiled. Kale thinks that what's wrong with him. Meanwhile the waiter served a glass of wine and Besan looks at it and thinks, is it wine? Kale picks the glass and starts drinking. He is enjoying a lot while eating. Meanwhile Besan is starting him at thinking that Kale smiled. Kale says that this is delicious. His father says yes, this tastes like gubra. He further says that he is glad to see him enjoying it. He reply that I hope you enjoy your meal, too father. Kale whispers to himself that I love being a lout. No one is calling me rude. He further says that one more thing he need to make nice with Besan. Clank clinks and says enjoying life as a rich kid, young lord's older brother, seems like a much better plan than managing a county by myself. While looking at Besan he thinks that if my plan does not work out, I will just pocket some money and go where the war would not to reach me. He is done with eating and dabs his mouth with a handkerchief. The father steps towards him and asks Kale, is there anything you need? He nods and say money, lots of money. Father replies all right, I will give you some. Kale smiles and says great, as much as you can please. His sibling seems clueless. Father gives Kale a check. Kale opens the check and says I did not accept him to give me this much. He thinks that this family is not only rich but filthy rich. While putting this in his pocket he says that this changes things. He calls Ron. He came saying yes my lord. He questions him that what is today's date. He tells Kale that today is March 29th, in the year 781 of the Felixian calendar. He questions that March 29th. Kale says he would better hurry. Choi Han will be coming to Weston soon. This is another morning and horse cart is moving. There is a sound if screech and Kale steps out of the cart. He reaches a place named as Poetry and Tea House. He turns and orders his man that you may leave now. He questions sir. Kale waves his hand and says don't make me say it twice. The man questions him again saying are you sure, you don't need me? While stepping towards the door he tells him that he will be a while. As he opens the door people are talking and some are reading books. But as he steps in there is silence everywhere and everyone is looking at him. While looking at the man Kale thinks that he must be the owner. He welcomes him. The man is Bilos, an intelligent son if a wealthy family. Clan looks at him and thinks that he looks like a piggy bank. Kale puts the money on the counter and tells him that the third floor is his today. He further says Bilos to bring him some tea, nothing sour. While looking at the books Kale questions him that are there novels here, or do you only carry poetry books? Bilos tells him that of course, we have novels. He informs Kale that we have a wide selection, my lord. Clan orders him to send up his best thriller along with a cup of tea. He replies yes, my lord. Kale gives him more money and tells him that he is going to order more tea later, so hold on to this. Bilos becomes shocked and tells him that 1,000,000 galleons is far too much. Clan think that this is his chance to flaunt his wealth. Thinking this he gives the money to Bilos and says I am loud, that's your tip. Clan steps up to the third floor. He sits on the table having some books and a cup of tea. He opens the book and starts thinking where he was. He starts reading that Choi Han was turned away this morning when he came to report to the castle. He prioritized mourning the dead over gathering on the perpetrators like a madman. After reading this Kale thinks that Choi has got a big heart. Kale starts reading again and he suddenly starts himself standing in the story. He says that so a bunch of dirty peasants are dead. Who cares? It has nothing to do with our county. Kale sees himself yelling Choi Han. Kale yells saying that this glass of wine is worth more than all their lives combined. Choi Han looks at him and replies saying how interesting. He smirks and says I wonder if I will be able to change your mind. After Kale sees Choi jumping on him, Kale gets jolt and he suddenly realizes that he is reading a book. He starts rubbing his shoulder and says that he can't believe that's how the story plays out, it's sending chill down his spine. He closes the book and thinks that he should stop thinking about the book. But he again glimpses at the book and says it's Choi Han, are they asking for his identification? While looking at it he thinks that he doesn't have any identity. He glimpses at the book again where Choi Han turns back and says here he goes. He further says that from what I remember, he goes away but then waits until nightfall to secretly enter the castle by climbing the walls. While clinking empty cup on the table he thinks that and that's when he turns into a drunk Kale. He starts walking down the stairs and tells Bilos that he is going out for a while. He tells him to leave his seat untouched. Bilos bows and says yes, my lord. He steps out of the place and slams the door. Everyone in there is shocked that Lord Kale left without breaking anything. While walking away Kale thinks that he can hear them. He further tells himself that he needs to cultivate his strength in order to protect himself against powerful opponents. While walking he says that several wars will break out across the continent soon, so to live long, healthy life I need at least a little bit of strength. He also says that of course, I have to make sure I don't become too strong, otherwise, pain will always find company. He says that there are ancient powers in the world. While looking at the patties he says that among those powers, what he need is an intangible shield like the ones used by mages. He says that today he begin his quest to obtain the unbreakable shield. The shopkeeper became very shocked to see Kale in front of his shop. He gets jolt and welcomes Kale saying welcome, my lord. While looking him in this shock Kale thinks that he is not even surprised. He tells the shopkeeper that he wants bread. The shopkeeper remains clueless and says I'm sorry. Kale tosses money towards him and starts pointing his finger from one corner to another. And he tells the shopkeeper that he wants everything from here to there. The shopkeeper is looking at the rolling money while Kale asks him to pack them up or he can go somewhere else. The shopkeeper again gets jolt and says that he will pack everything as quickly as he can. Kale lifts the bag and starts walking while thinking that things are different here than Korea, this is a fantasy world. While he is walking everyone is staring at him. He glances and starts talking huge steps and thinks that he need to get out of here. Two little children are noticing him. He reaches his place, puts the bag on the ground and take a deep breath. He turns while looking at the city, he says that he made it pretty far up. He further says that the bag is quite heavy, even though it's only filled with bread. He pushes an old wooden door and it cracks. Kale steps in while thinking how old is this place. There is a huge tree. While looking at him Kale thinks that this tree must be centuries old. He hears someone saying don't go near that tree. Kale turns and sees that there is a small girl and a small kid. They are telling him to stay away, it will kill you. They explains Kale, a flesh-eating tree. According to rumors, the people that hung themselves on this tree rotted to pieces overnight. Clan grins and says this the tree he have been looking for. Long, long ago there once lived a girl who served the gods. But was so obsessed with eating that she was kicked out of the temple. And in the spot where she died sprouted a tree. While putting his hand in the bag he thinks that her grief and powers are embedded in this tree. Kale thinks about the tree that it holds the powers of unbreakable shield. He grabs a bread and throws it saying is it here? While the kids are mumbling and telling Kale to stay away. Kale becomes irritated and says there are always people who don't know how to mind their own business. He thinks that he should get rid of these kids first. He stands, the girl says you will die and the boy says that tree eats people. Kale whaps a packet and throws on them and tells them to get lost. The girl fumbles while the boy keeps saying it kills people. Kale gives them a dead stare and asks don't you know that I'm Kale the Lout? They terrifies and run away. The girls keep running while saying that she hopes Kale don't die. Kale came near to the tree again and says all right, let's try this again. He grabs another bread and swaps it and says here it goes. While looking at the hole he says that his hand almost got sucked in, too. The shield was created by the remnants of the powers left behind by the starving dead. While sitting there he thinks that this is an ancient power. He looks at the hole he says that then again, folksy stuff like this tends to be more reliable. Pitch black, he says that he read that it needs to be fed until the shadow fades. The darkness embodies the shadow of the dead. A light will appear once the darkness is lifted. He grips the bag and says so if I can get the light to appear the unbreakable shield will be mine. He empties the bag into the hole and says eat up. There is silence and no reaction from the tree. Kale stands and thinks another 10 bags ealing deep resentment. He starts waking and says he will be back tomorrow. Those two kids are sitting and enjoying while eating the bread. Kale looks at them and thinks that they are too scared to go near the tree, but what if they stick their heads in the hole and gets eaten? That would be bad, for them not me. While the kids are staring at him he turns and tells them that if they want more bread tomorrow, don't tell anyone about this. The night is almost there. Kale steps down the stairs. Billows says are you leaving, my lord? He replies yes. Billows says that he hopes to see Kale again. While Kale is leaving he tells Billows that the tea was excellent. He keeps on talking and says so was the book, even though I only read half of it. Kale tells him that he liked that the main character was acknowledged for his skills and went through a lot of growth. He orders Billows that don't let anyone else read that book, so that he can pick up right where he left off when he comes back. Billows smiles and says, "Of course, Lord Kale. I'll keep this book just for you." As he steps out of the place, Billows says, "Please visit us again, I'll be waiting." Kale replies, "Yes, sure." This scene is at a little bar later. As Kale steps in there, the manager of that bar bows and welcomes. He says, "Oh goodness, welcome, Lord Kale." While looking at him, Kale thinks that they're afraid of him. Of course they are. Kale has a habit of breaking everything around him when he drinks. He tosses the money towards the manager and orders him to bring the usual. He further tells him to bring roasted chicken breast, without salt. The manager pardons Kale and asks him, "Aren't you going to grab a table first?" He dashes and says, "I'll bring your drink, right away, sir." There is a sudden silence everywhere. He starts thinking that all the lowlifes and thugs are scared to make eye contact with me. Now when I thinks about it, how strange of Kale. Usually, the troublemakers of an aristocratic family will hang out with thugs and other roughnecks, but Kale hates people like them. Kale thinks that they're vermin. While sliding the bottle towards Kale, he says, "Here you are, sir." Kale thanks him and takes the bottle and starts walking outside of the bar. Everyone is looking at him while he is thinking that this is what Kale ordered. It must be the most expensive bottle they have. Kale opens the bottle and starts gulping. He wipes his mouth and starts walking while thinking that this is a stiff drink. Kale keeps walking and thinks that start at the gate and take 100 steps along the wall. He peeks in and thinks just as he expected. This is the spot. The moment Choi Han jumped over these walls. There are two kittens. A little kitten that was lying right where he was supposed to land, got pushed away by another kitten. Kale is looking at them and says, "This world is full of such coincidence." He sprained his ankle trying to avoid these cats. Meanwhile, he see a man sitting at some distance. Kale becomes nervous and says, "Here he is." He thinks that good thing I drank a bit. He suddenly makes a plan and says, "I have to take a jab at him, but also leave a good first impression as well." He put the food in front of kittens and says, "You guys look hungry." He slides the food towards them and says, "Poor things, here you go." Kale, while looking at them, thinks that they look younger than he expected. He rips the breast and asks them, "Can you have a chicken breast?" He pats the kitten and says, "I hope you get better after trying eating this." While the kittens are munching, he glances at the man and asks him, "Do they have home?" He further asks a place to sleep. "Aren't you hungry?" While patting the kittens, Kale thinks that he is not talking, he is probably observing me. He questions the man saying, "Are you not going to answer me?" The man mutters that he is starving. Kale steps towards him and tells the man to follow him. He further tells him that I will give you some food. The fastest way to a man's heart is through his stomach. The man wobbles and Kale says him, "That's come along me now." While looking at kittens, Kale thinks that I usually hate cats, but these guys are pretty cute. The man is staring at Kale, while he says that I can't ignore them now. Kale pats the cat and says, "I guess you like me, but I have to go, so see you later." Both the kittens run away. Now Kale is walking and the man is following him. They reach the castle. The man, who is actually Choi Han, stops. Kale turns while thinking that although he didn't say anything, Choi Han is probably thinking things over. Kale asks him, "What is it?" Choi Han remains silent and Kale thinks that he's trying to see if I'm an easy kill or not. Kale asks him, "Aren't you coming?" While they both are standing, there is a sudden fidget. Kale throbs and says it's not exactly pleasant to hear people stutter all the time. The door clunks and he enters the castle. Ron bows and welcomes Kale, saying, "Welcome, my lord." Kale greets him thinking that I can't believe he was actually waiting for me, scary old man. Ron glances at the man who came along Kale. While looking at them, Kale thinks that he literally sees sparks everywhere. Kale starts walking up the stairs and asks Choi Han to follow him. Ron asks, "Is everything all right?" He says that I can attend to this man if you need me to. Kale replies saying, "No, it's okay." While taking steps, he thinks that was enough of an introduction. Someone calls him saying, "Lord Kale." He is Deputy Butler Hans. He chatters and says, "You came home after drinking today." Kale sighs and thinks this guy is in charge of me. Kale flips the bottle towards him and orders him to throw it away. He replies yes sir. After this Kale starts walking away again and Butler says my lord. Where are you going? Kale is walking and say the second kitchen there is one more person Choi Han needs to meet today. He enters the kitchen and say here he is. He is Ron's son, Vic Ross. While looking at him Kale think that he's a scary guy, too. He further says that I can't believe he has been cooking with that glare on his face and with those hands. Why does Choi Han have to meet him? When Vic Ross saw Choi Han beating up Kale, he was so impressed that he decided to follow him. Kale is thinking 2 birds, 1 stone. He further thinks that if I introduce him to Choi Han now, his father will leave with him. Kale grabs the shoulder of Choi Han and orders Vic Ross to cook something for him. While having a knife in his hands he questions I'm sorry. Kale says hey, put this knife down. Kale tells him that I said cook something for this man, he says he's hungry. He bows and says all right, sir. Kale smirks and thinks Vic Ross, Choi Han, and even Ron. The 3 of them are connected now. Kale further tells him to prepare something for me too, I'm also hungry. He says that and this goes without saying, but use only the finest ingredients. He further tells him that yesterday's steak was excellent, you are a great cook. He opens the door while saying I think something like that steak it would be good, make it quick. As he steps out of the kitchen Butler rushes to him and says my lord. What should I do with that man? Kale replies him saying he is my guest but do what you want with him. He turns and thinks since I have introduced them to each other, I am done for the day. He keeps on thinking and says if my plan doesn't work, I will have Choi Han beat up someone else and have Vic Ross watch. He further tell Butler that I will take my dinner in my room. Hans reaches to the father and tells him everything. The father says he went to the tea shop owned by Merchant Flynn's bastard son and brought home an unidentified boy with him. He further says that on top of that, Kale didn't drink much tonight. Hans questions should I have someone tail him, my lord? The count replies no I have control over everything that happens within my county. He orders him to just continue to keep an eye on him and report your observations to me. The man bows and says yes, my lord. The count is in deep thoughts and says Kale has changed. The count is sitting and is in his deep thoughts. He is thinking that something is different about Kale. He has not gotten smarter or stronger, but his behavior has changed. He calls Hans. Han replies yes, Count Hennetus. Count tells him that I need information on Flynn's bastard son. Hans bows and says yes, my lord. The count is standing and thinking Kale is not the only one that has changed. He says that he and feel tension permeating the continent. He says that over the years, the Hennetus family has protected their wealth and expanded little by little. He remembers the time when his sons were small, he used to say them that, your name does not have to grow down in history. He also used to say them, just strive for peace and happiness. He walks while saying that we must repair the castle walls. Kale wakes up and is feeling queasy. Ron is standing in front of him. Kale looked at him and thinks seeing Ron having a cup of lemonade as first thing in the morning is only making it worse. Ron smiles and says you were sound asleep, so I didn't wake you my lord. Kale glances at him and asks did you hurt your neck? Ron while giving him the cup says are you showing concern for me, my lord? Kale replies no, it just caught my eye. Ron tells him that a kitten with sharp claws scratched me a little. Kale is gulping the lemonade and thinks which innocent person is he referring to this time. Kale returns the empty cup and starts walking. Ron asks him will you be leaving right away? Kale while holding the door says yes. I have some things to take care of. Ron replies all right, but my lord, how was the lemonade? Kale turns and says it was delicious. While opening the door he turs and look at Ron while thinking what was that about? Why did he ask me that? As he opens the door he finds Joey Hands standing in front of him. Kale gets scared and slams the door. He says that scared me. Ron says that I didn't think you would be that startled, my lord. He tells him that your guest from yesterday has been waiting outside your room. He further explains him that you opened the door so quickly that I didn't have a chance to tell you I asked him to wait in his room but he insisted that he must see you. Kale stares at Ron and thinks, didn't have a chance to tell me? He thinks that Ron is a mean old man and I know you didn't mention it on purpose. Kale opens the door and asks Choi Han what is it. While looking at him he thinks that he's like a statue. Choi Han mumbles saying, repay. Kale becomes nervous and says what? He tells him that I will repay you for the food. Kale replies him thinking repay me? He says, you don't have to. Is that everything? Kale thinks that I would be crazy to make him work for me. Choi Han clenches his fist and tells him that actually I have a favor to ask. Kale throbs and thinks in his mind that he is probably going to ask me to help him clean up the town of Harris. He replies him that you don't need to involve me in it. He further tells him that you can ask Hans, he is a competent deputy butler. He will do just about anything. Kale grabs Ron's shoulders and tell him that Ron is also a very capable man, so I am sure he will be able to help out as well. After saying this to Choi Han, Kale turns to Ron. He tells him that this is my guest, so help him to the best of your abilities. Choi Han says, but you don't know my lord. Who I am. Kale looks at him and says, do I have to? He further questions that do I need a reason to help someone in need? Kale further tells him that I don't think you will ask us to do anything too difficult, but if you do, Hans will turn you down. Saying this, Kale turns and says, well, I'm a busy man, goodbye. Kale is thinking that he have to spend money today, so he is going to ask for more allowance. He keeps on stepping while Ron assures him saying, Lord Kale, I will do my best to help this man. Kale says that whatever. All the main events of the book are reserved for the main character and his companions anyway. Ron is looking at him and thinks, from what I remember, that fearless puppy hates sour food. He still doesn't like it very much. Looking at the empty cup he says, but he drank the whole cup this morning. Ron touches his wound and thinks that it looked like the fearless puppy is scared. Ron raised his eyebrows and thinks, does he know something? He glimpses at Choi Han, who is saying him to show the way. Ron smirks while looking at him and thinks in his mind that this guy is pretending to be an upright person, even though his hands are stained with blood. While saying all right, he further thinks that he is very twisted. Ron starts walking and asks Choi Han to follow him. He turns and starts following Ron. There is a big whoosh of air. Kale is standing in front of that tree while holding a bag full of breads. He starts shaking the bag and empties it in the hole. There is a sound coming from the hole and asking for more. This is the voice of the girls he read about in the book. The girl who starved to death while serving the gods. Kale stands and thinks that Deruth told me to come see him in his study for some reason, so I'll have to leave before the sun goes. He says that I'm not even halfway there yet. While stepping away from the tree he thinks I would better get moving. He says that his plan is to get at least half done today. As he came outside of that place he see the two kids sitting and eating the bread. Kale says to himself that since I cleared the shelves of the bakery I went to yesterday, it's going to take a while for them to make a lot of fresh bread. He thinks that he will have to look for a new place. Suddenly a lady calls him saying, my lord. We have plenty of bread at our bakery. Kale throws money towards her while thinking that this woman knows how to do business. He tells her that he will take everything, hurry up. The lady becomes happy and bows while saying, one moment, please. She puts the bag filled with bread on the floor and says, here you are. Kale likes her speed and while picking up the bag he thinks that was super fast. The lady further tells him that I can make more if you would like, my lord. Kale looks at her and thinks I'm starting to like her even more. In the meantime another shopkeeper also says that my lord. We can make even more. Kale throws money towards him and questions him, is that so? He tells him that I'll visit you bakery next time, have a bag ready. He thinks that I'll be able to collect bread from 3 bakeries tomorrow. He says that I'm happy that things are going smoothly. While he is doing all this Ron is keeping eyes on him. Looking at him, Ron questions himself that what is he up to, has he lost his mind? He remembers the old time and says I didn't pay attention when father said he was an interesting guy, but now I'm starting to change my mind. He thinks that maybe he will be just as interesting as that black-haired fellow. Kale gives the kids a bottle. While looking at it the kids questions this isn't bread. They further say it's not cake either. Kale asks them to move over. While the boy blocks his way saying you can't die, master. Because Kale Kim Roksu was an unremarkable orphan, many people pitied him. While looking at the kids he thinks that, does anyone need a reason to pity the poor? The boy's leg is hurt, he says that he used to take that the wrong way, but I understood what it meant once I become an adult. While looking at them he thinks this is annoying. He says that I hate seeing a hurt kid, but I don't plan on taking care of them either. He tells the kids that he won't die. Kale comes close to the tree. There is a sound like someone is asking for more, saying give me more. Kale shakes the bag into the hole and empties it. Kale stands and looks into the hole. He says that the hole is not as dark anymore. I guess I got my money's worth. As he turns, he questions himself, did the kids go away? Kale whimpers and thinks I feel much better now that I can't see the child's hurt leg. He starts waking and at some distance there are those kittens. He looks at them and thinks they're the kittens from last night. I'm sure they don't remember me. He shoos them and says I should not make more trouble for myself. He comes to the castle and reaches to the count. Kale and Basson both are standing in front of the county. Kale questions, could you say that again, please? County replies, sure Kale, I want you to go to the royal palace as the representative of the family. Kale seems clueless and questions the palace, now? County replies and explains, originally, Basson was supposed to go but you are the eldest. He tells him that the royal palace has sent out invitations to all the children of the Nobel families. He says that although Basson has been attending same events for the past 2 years, I want you to go this time. Kale sweats and questions, a big event at the royal palace? He remembers what he has read in the novel, starts thinking about the terrorist attack at the plaza. In the novel, the mysterious organization carries out a terrorist attack at a plaza where many residents of the capital city are gathered. Choi Han stops about half of the attack and saves countless lives. Because of this, he becomes acquainted with the royal family and ends up befriending the crown prince. He is getting goosebumps again. He thinks that he can't believe he have to be there during the attack. He peeks at Basson and thinks normally he goes to these official events, should I send him instead? He says to himself that he don't want to go somewhere dangerous. He thinks that he can't just tell father to send Basson in his stead. He questions himself, saying there is no way he would send a troublemaker like me to the capital. Why is he trying to make me go? Count tells him that you will be leaving in 5 days. Kale after listening this thinks, in 5 days? Kale will get beaten up by Choi Han by then. He further thinks that which means he won't be able to go to the capital if the original storyline plays out. Count says that before Basson started attending these gatherings, you used to go to them. Try to remember what that was like. Kale replies, father, this all of a sudden for me. Kale questions that I'm not entirely sure why I'm the one who has to go. He says that let me take some time to think over it. Count says alright, you may go now. They both bow down and leave while saying yes, sir. The door clacks. Basson says I don't see why you can't go. Kale turns and thinks this is not how the story is supposed to progress. Because Kale was pushed out of the line of succession, Basson has been acting as the heir for the past 2 years. Yet he's telling Kale has more than enough reason to be the family representative. Kale sighs and thinks this complicates things. He says, but then again, I think I can handle whatever happens after this. There is a good chance that Kale will return home safely. While looking at Basson he thinks, above all, if Basson dies before inheriting the family name, I will be in trouble. He says that if I want to live a juicy life, I need him to stay alive. Hans comes and says, there you, my lord. He is saying about the favor your guest. Kale suddenly turns and interrupts him, saying bring him to me. Hans becomes shocked. While looking him, Kale says, judging by the looks on his face, I'm guessing he took care of Choi Han's request. He says that I have to go to the palace in a few days, in case he refuses tell him this. He says repayment. And thinks if I must go, then I'm going to use. Kale says that tell him to repay me for the food. He thinks that Choi Han to the best if my advantage. Choi Han is sitting on the sofa. Kale glances at him and thinks look like Ron has been feeding him well. He also thinks that, and it seems Ron, Vic Ross, and Choi Han are all getting along. Choi Han questions Kale, how can I repay you, sir? Kale thinks, well, he certainly got straight to the point. Kale remembers about the book. He thinks that the beginning part of the birth of a hero is starting to change a bit. Kale grins and thinks I have been trying to stick to the story, but Kale going to the capital city will shake things up even more. Kale slides a piece of paper and says, first, I need to know what you can do. He tells him that, in other words, this is an interview. Choi Han says go ahead, my lord. Kale questions him, can you protect a person? Choi Han questions him, what do you mean? Kale is sitting in cross-legged manner and thinks even though my plans have suddenly changed, I may be able to profit from this. He says to himself, I will prevent Choi Han and his companions from obtaining ancient powers and take them for myself. While thinking that they won't need them anyway, he tells him that exactly what it sounds like. First, do you have the skills to protect someone? Choi Han slumps and says I am not sure. Choi Han grips his pants, being anxious. Kale is thinking I can't be too aggressive with him yet. He asks him, can you kill a person? Choi Han gets a jolt and says yes. Kale replies, then you can guard them as well. Choi Han says that is a difficult job, my lord. Kale replies difficult doesn't mean impossible. Kale remembers his old self and start thinking. He thinks that as Kim broke too, I wasn't able to avoid difficult things in life. That's why I was thrilled that I could now live as Kale the Lout. He thinks that, but now I have got a giant obstacle ahead of me, so I need someone who can jump over that hurdle with me. Choi Han smiles and replies, I suppose you are right, my lord. Kale says that okay, I have one last question. Choi Han replies, go ahead, my lord. Kale questions him, what is your name? Choi Han questions, do you not know my name? Kale replies, I do, and thinks in his mind that you are the guy that was supposed to beat me. Kale tells him that, but I have only heard it from others, I want you to personally tell me. Choi Han replies, my name is Choi Han. Choi Han stands and they both shake their hands and Kale replies, all right, I am Kale Henitus. Ken slides a paper towards Choi Han and says, I have a simple job for you. While looking at the paper, Choi Han questions Rosalind. Lark? Kale starts speaking and says, Rosalind, the prince of a neighboring kingdom who survived an assassination attempt. And Lark, the Wolf King's heir and the sole survivor of the Blue Wolf tribe. He keeps speaking and says Lark may seem weak and unremarkable, but he turns into a violent wolf beast man when he goes berserk. As for Rosalind, she possesses destructive powers that are second only to Choi Han. He further says that she is a heroine in the making who dreams not of succeeding the throne, but of establishing the strongest magic tower in the continent. The people who tried to assassinate Rosalind were all tortured by Vicarious later on. Then he thinks about Vic Ross and says that's the most frightening thought I have had lately. Kale stands and replies yes, Rosalind and Lark. He further says so you can read, that's good. Kale picks a folded paper and says anyway, you will travel with me until a certain place. He unfolds that paper on the table and this is a map. He points at a spot and says once we do, follow the directions on my note. He keeps on speaking that there is a reason why I have to travel with him at first. Kale starts thinking in the beginning of The Birth of a Hero, a Marquis appears as a villain after Kale. He makes life difficult for Choi Han and the Crown Prince at every turn. He keeps thinking and says he also raises the Mad Dragon. He tries to tame a hatchling less than 5 years old, but eventually, the dragon escapes and goes mad. Then Choi Han mercifully kills the beast and puts it out of its pain. Kale thinks that I can't believe I have to travel through the village that will be attacked by that mad dragon, but if I take a detour I will arrive at the capital late. He thinks that I have to either make Choi Han take care of the dragon first, or free it before it goes crazy. He asks Choi Han to bring the 2 people on that list to the capital. Kale says that's all I want in return for the food. Choi Han glances and says, do I have to protect these people? Kale replies, do what you want, but you must come to the capital. He further tells him to make sure to show up in one piece, too. Kale questions, can you at least protect yourself? He further questions Choi Han that why aren't you answering me, can you do it too? Han nods his head and says yes I can. Kale sighs and thinks I should have done this over drinks. He raises his hand and says you may go now. He further tells to Han that everything we talked about today is between us, you know that right? Choi Han smiles and replies I know, my lord. Kale comes to his father and says father, I need money. The count replies all right, I will let the manager know that the count gives him an allowance. Now Kale is laying on his bed and looking at that allowance. Kale thinks that money really is the best. In the meanwhile Ron comes in and says my lord. This is honey lemon tea. He further says my son made it especially, for you to have a good sleep. He smiles and says remember that I am always here beside you. Kale thinks that old man, now I am wide awake. While remembering the face of Ron he thinks that he should send them away with Choi Han. Kale is walking and says, I felt like I watched a horror movie this morning. He remembers the time when Ron says, my lord, this is your first visit to the capital, isn't it? I am very good at hunting rabbits. Ron also says the trick is to keep a careful eye on them because you never know when they might run away. After you make the kill you must gut them. Ron smirks and says, which is something I'm very good at. He further thinks, but I'm glad that Ron and Vic Ross are coming with me to the capital. The shopkeeper comes to Kale and says, my lord, you are early. Kale questions him, where is the bread? Meanwhile he is thinking he is certainly getting more comfortable with me. The shopkeeper replies, everything is ready, of course. He further says, that is this really your last order? Kale replies, why do you want to make more money? The shopkeeper replies, yes, I do. Kale grins and pats his shoulder and says, I will visit again if I'm craving pastries. After saying this, Kale picks the bag and starts moving. On his way he sees those two kids sitting and staring him. Kale looks at them and thinks, are they homeless? Looks like they've been waiting for me. He extends a packet of breads towards them and says, here you go. The kids hesitate a little bit but then grabs. After this Kale starts moving. As he reaches close to the tree he thinks that I'm glad it's foggy today. No one will see what I'm up to, or what I'm about to get from this place. Kale opens the bag and start throwing the breads into the hole. There is again a sound coming from the hole asking for more bread. Kale opens other bag and empties them into the hole. Suddenly the hole shines. While looking at it Kale grins and think it is turning white. I guess this wasn't all for nothing. Suddenly there is too much noise and the woman is asking for more. Kale, while covering his ears, thinks the book never mentioned this. The woman says, bring me more and I shall bestow upon you a gift. Kale blinks and says, a gift. After this Kale opens another bag and start throwing the breads into the hole. He says the hole should become totally transparent after this. There is a flash coming outside from the hole and the woman is saying it's so delicious. She starts admiring the food and says, soft texture, the last bag was especially good. I guess food improved with time. The woman keeps chattering and says, anyway, the third bag was my favorite. She further says, back in my days we didn't have a word for bread. She says, I could tell the wheat was grown on good soil, not all wheat bread tastes the same. You get what I'm saying, right? Kale flinch and thinks, is this how she kept people from obtaining this power? After this the woman says, I'm stuffed now, the bread was so good. Kale nods and says, I feel like food wasn't the problem, more like she had to bottle up everything she wanted to say. The woman keeps talking and says there wasn't anything like this in the olden days. She tells that those jerks from the dark forest only gave me horrible stuff and then they kicked me out for there. What a load of crap. Kale nods and thinks, I need the ancient power, so I must listen to what she has to say. The woman further says, that is when my colleagues and I left with the hopes of correcting the world. I don't think I will ever be able to give up food like this, even if I put on weight. It is so unfair that I died eating dirt. Kale think, I guess she's done talking about her past. Women replies her saying, yes, that was a very specific and impressive food review. He further tells her that, but you were a bit loud. She replies, thank you, you appreciate my critic. You are a nice guy. Kale thinks, so it does understand me. Suddenly, there is a change in color. While looking into it he thinks the color is changing and it's looked incredible. There is a sudden glow. Kale reaches near to the tree and tries to touch it and thinks it feels bomb. Kale smiles and thinks this is it. The woman tells him that I will keep you safe. And she suddenly enters Kale's body. Kale says that I can feel a warm and pure power involves me. The shield's top priority is to protect its master's life. Its oath rests within the heart. The shield will be with Kale until his heart stops beating. Kale puts his hand on his heart and says, I like this. He thinks that I can feel the power protecting my heart, and I think my heart is beating a little stronger now. Like the shield, every ancient power will leave its unique mark. Kale breathes and thinks, now, according to the book, if I use my ancient power. He closes his eyes and opens them. There is the flash. He smiles and the shield is in front of him. He says, the unbreakable shield will appear before my eyes. Kale look at the shield and says this will block at least 2 of Choi Han's attacks. He says that despite its name, the unbreakable shield can be broken. But it will not disappear. He says that if it's stuck by a forceful attack it will break after protecting its master's heart. Then the power of the heart will gradually restore the shield. A beating heart is what gives the shield its power. The stronger my heart is, the stronger the shield will be. Kale says that I am going to enhance this shield one more time on the way to the capital. Kale says that my plan is to make it strong enough to protect me for 10 or 5 minutes, against powerful warriors like Choi Han. Kale says that like how it feels. He says that they're just one thing, it looks too holy. Then again, I don't think I'll have people fight for me. There is a heavy rainfall. There are also kittens on the street and they are getting wet. The kittens are touching Kale's feet. Kale picks them and bring them home. He gives them to Hans. Hans gets shocked and says, "My lord. What are those things?" Kale replies, "Don't ask stupid questions, just take them." Hans replies, "They are the cutest kittens I've ever seen." He further asks, "My lord, may I look after these adorable kittens?" Kale replies, "Yes, if you'd like." Kale further says they will quiet down if you feed them and their siblings. Hans questions what. Kale informs him that they smell faintly of herbs and bread. I figured out the answer thinking back on the day I first met them. Kale tells him, pouting towards those kittens, and says the silver cat is probably the older sister with gray hair and the red cat is probably her little brother. Kale leans towards them and says, "We will talk later." Hans says, "Were you talking to me, my lord?" Kale replies, "No, not you." Kale takes off his coat and questions, "Where's Ron?" Hans smiles and says, "I heard that you are going to the capital and that Mr. Choi Han will accompany you halfway, my lord." Hans tells him that Ron and Mr. Choi Han went out to get supplies for the road and Chef Vic Ross went with them too. Kale replies, "That's good to hear that he thinks that I guess the three of them are getting along." Kale scowls and Hans says they seem excited about going on this trip with you, my lord. Kale goes to Billos. As he enters, Billos asks him, having a slow day because of the rain? "Welcome back, my lord." Kale questions him, "I said I would come back, didn't I?" He tells Billos that I'm here to keep my promise. Billos replies, "Indeed, promise are to be kept." Billos further questions him, "Would you like the same book and tea?" Kale replies, "Yes, prepare 3 cups of tea this time." There is heavy rain outside and Kale steps up to the 3rd floor. Billos comes with tea and says, "It's pouring outside, isn't it?" Kale looks at him and thinks Choi Han, Vic Ross, Ron and finally Billos. He keeps thinking that Billos didn't play much of role in the beginning, but he later swears allegiance to Choi Han and reveals his true ambitions. The key word here is reveal. He wanted to be acknowledged as a son and a brother. He's a greedy guy. A very brothersome character, but his greed makes him human, which I don't dislike. Billos flinch and says, "I heard you're headed to the capital, my lord." Kale replies, "Yes, and?" Billos smiles and tells him that I plan on going there as well. He further says that I guess I'll be following you there. Kale says it makes sense if he wants to meet Choi Han. Billos smiles and thinks, "You seem to have changed, my lord. You are nothing like your reputation." Kale replies, "You mean my reputation as a lout?" Billos replies, "Correct, haven't you always been one?" Kale drops the cup and says, "Maybe I should have shown up drunk and smashed something." Billos. Kale stands and says, "You can't call your father, father, or your brother, brother. Are you going to let yourself be defined by the fact that you're an illegitimate child?" Kale asks him, "Are you happy with your place in life?" Kale further says, "Surely not. I have been a troublemaker of my family for about a decade, since I was 8 years old." Kale says, "But Billos, if you've done something for 10 years it's okay to move on to other things." Kale further says, "I can't be a troublemaker forever. Don't you feel the same way?" Billos laughs out loud and thinks I'm sick of all this too. Billos and Kale is sitting in front of each other. Billos says, "I'm sick of all this, too." Kale says, "That's what I thought." Billos stands and says, "Then I will see you at the capital, my lord." Kale waves and says, "I doubt that." Kale thinks that I can't have Billos meet me at the capital because he is going to end involved with Choi Han. Billos, Ron and Choi Han are looking at each other. Billos turns and other 2 steps towards Kale. Kale looks at them and thinks that they ran into each other, just like they did in the book. Kale says that I knew you would along, Ron. He further says that Hans told me that Vic Ross also went with you. Kale thinks that I'm guessing he went back to work. He does have a strong sense of responsibility. Ron looks at Billos and asks, "My lord, are you close with the owner here?" Kale replies, not really. Ron questions, is that so? Kale thinks, why does he want to know? He says that I get anxious whenever he asks me a question. Choi Han says, I guess the rumors are just rumors after all. Kale thinks about what is he talking about. Billos comes and says, here's the tea you ordered, my lord. Billos questions, should I serve it to these men? Kale says yes. Kale tells them that I ordered some before you guys got here. Billos puts the cup on the table and Kale says, hot lemon tea. Kale looks at Ron and tells him that I ordered it especially for you, Ron. Kale says, I assume it's your favorite, since you keep giving it to me. Ron looks at Kale and did not reply. He remembers that time when he used to give Kale lemonade saying it will help you sleep. He also remembers the time when he gives Kale honey lemon tea saying my son made it especially for you. Choi Han thanks while Ron remains silent. Ron grabs the cup and take a sip. Kale look at him and thinks he didn't even react to what I said. Suddenly, there is a sound of clack. Choi Han glimpses at asks, can you quiet down a bit? Ron looks at him and thinks about the fight they had. He thinks that after that fight, Vikros kept asking him for a duel. While remembering Choi Han's face he thinks, but that merciless bastard told my son that he is going to become a protector. Choi said that night that Lord Kale told him that even he could do it. Ron further thinks that was surprising in and of itself, but I just heard something even more fascinating at this tea house. Kale smiles and thinks I can't be a troublemaker forever. Ron raised the cup thinking things are getting interesting. Choi Han says the tea is very good, my lord. Kale thinks that there is a tension between them, but they always stick together. Kale remembers the novel. In the novel Ron and Choi Han's relationship was contractual, but they made sure to respect each other's boundaries, even though some parts of the story have been altered. Kale says that I guess they still have a similar relationship. He further thinks that it's a shame that some stories' elements have changed, but I come first, you can't always live by the books. He says that after all sweet tears are the best. Billos asks, are you leaving already, my lord? Kale replies yes. Billos says, I suppose the next time we meet will be at the capital city. Kale replies, no, I will be coming here daily. Billos replies, is that so, to read? My lord. Kale tells him maybe, maybe not. Billos says, well, please stop by any time, you are always welcome here, my lord. Ron grins while looking at Kale and says, I must have grown fond of him. Choi Han says, I don't want us to get close. Ron replies, I'm not talking about you. Ron thinks that I should tell Vikros to prepare food that the little pup master will like. Ron further thinks that he is the lout, but on the day his mother passed away that little pup went to comfort his father first. He thinks that even on days when he came home completely drunk, he never hurt any of his family members. Ron thinks that I am afraid I've known him for too long. Kale looks the sky and says the rain has stopped. As he starts moving he see the kittens on the street. Kale says, I almost forgot about you guys. He says I should have bought Choi Han with me, he loves small animals. Choi Han says that he say that I'll go to my room then, my lord. I need to develop a stronger heart in order to protect people. Kale looks at him and thinks he's strong enough already, why does he want to get stronger? Hans while wiping the kittens questions, what do you think, my lord? Aren't they just cutest, fluffiest and sweetest babies in the world? He says, but they are not very affectionate, they wouldn't let me pet them. He questions, aren't they, my lord? Han is beneath the cats now. Kale looks at him and thinks anyway, the cats look totally a home like they've always been here. He questions, did Hans cast a spell or something? Hans peeks in and says, hurry up and go. My lord, please call me if the cats need anything at all. Hans says, I see a clip their nails and brush their coats. He leaves saying, I will attend to you now, my lord, I'm going to wash up. Ron looks at them and says, it looks like you're from the cat tribe. He says, is the silver one is fog and the red one poison? Ron grins and says, since cat people are nimble and have good reflexes, they'll prove useful with a bit of training. While putting his hand forward he says I should prepare a parting gift for the little pup master. Kale is standing while both kittens are following him. Kale asks them, are you going to keep following me? The kitten starts rubbing his feet. Kale looks at them and thinks I already have a plan for these two. Kale grins and says, you keep. The kittens are meowing. Kale says, don't meow, talk. Kale sits and kittens came closer. The girl says I want meat, I am still hungry. The boy says I want cake. Kale smiles and says I will keep you well fed, you know that. The kittens looks at him and says we will do it. This is 4 days later and everyone is on the table while having lunch. The count says Kale, you're leaving for the capital today, but you don't seem nervous. Kale lifts his food and while eating he thinks that according to the book, on a rainy day which was yesterday I was supposed to have gotten brutally beaten up by Choi Han. Kale smirks and says but that didn't happen. He remembers the shield and thinks that now that I have the unbreakable shield, I can always feel it protecting me. Kale picks the glass and while drinking he thinks that even if things go wrong with people like Ron and Vic Ross, I will be able to protect myself, at least once. After thinking all this Kale says Father, I asked for fewer attendants, but the number went up again. Father is about to speak something and Mother interrupts. She tells him that was my doing. While picking the glass she further tells Kale that if you show up with only a few attendants, people might think we don't have enough servants. She further says that I didn't do it because I thought less of you. Kale shakes the glass and there is a sound of slosh. Kale says especially aristocrats are concerned with keeping up appearances. Kale is looking at her stepmother. The eldest daughter of a poor baron, Violen dreamed of running her own caravan someday. She first started out by selling luxury items to aristocrats. And then became interested in sculpture when she came to Hennetus. Then she met Count de Ruth Hennetus and fell in love with him. Now she plays a central role in Hennetus' cultural enterprise. Violen takes great pride in her own life, and she is very proud that she is part of the Hennetus family. Violen says many people think that appearances are everything. Kale thinks that so she wants me to show up with a large entourage. He keeps that having more servants will definitely make my life easier. I've gotten so used to having them help me that it feels weird to change by myself now. Kale also thinks about the dragon. He thinks that however a crazy black dragon is going to appear soon. He thinks that if I fail to free it first, a lot of people will die. He gulps the drink and thinks that I don't care about other people, but I don't really want to watch them die in front of me. He keeps on thinking that I don't want to be responsible for those that get hurt. Kale thinks that since I was young, I have had to take care of myself, so I know the burden of being responsible for a life. Kale says her stepmother that are often reflects what you are feeling inside. Mother questions so you have heard that saying. Kale says yes, I have. While swirling the glass Kale says, sculptors don't create things they see, but they create things they see. Kale says that I read that quote at an exhibition saying, appearances are unimportant. He thinks of the sigh at the exhibition hall for new sculptors which is craved by Violen. Violen further says that okay, I will leave the matter you. Take as many Orphée attendants as you want. Violen further says that but I will prepare only the finest for everything else, including the carriage. She says that it's only fitting for a family if our status. Violen says that it sounds good, I want nothing but the best. She says alright, I will get you an expensive carriage that can travel over rough terrain. The count starts speaking and asks Kale a question. He questions, Kale, did you take a look at the document detailing the characteristics of each aristocratic family and their children? He replies yes, it was fun reading. He further tells that some were stingy, some were smart but creepy, some were just idiots, and some were obsessed with power. He says that these were all sorts of people. The count replies so you actually read it. Kale is slicing his food while the father says Will, you can do whatever you want. He keeps speaking and says Kale, a strange rumor has been going around. He keeps telling that apparently, the man-eating tree has changed and it has produced green leaves. Count also tells Kale that other plants have also started growing near it. He questions Kale, isn't that interesting? Kale thinks that of course the count knows about my trips to the slums, but I doubt about he knows about the shield. He keeps thinking that all count can guess is that I caused the tree change. Kale replies yes, that is interesting news. The count says indeed, but at the same time it's just a silly rumor. The count says that we must be careful of rumors. Theirs is nothing scarier gossip. He further says that but not to worry, our family is safe within our county. Kale replies I'll keep that in mind. He thinks that again, I feel like I will be able to lead a very comfy life in Hennetus. Kale slides his plate while thinking I should quickly complete my trip to the capital and live out my days here. Kale stand up and says I have work to do, so I'll say my goodbyes now. His siblings are staring at him. Kale peeks at them and says what is it? They bow down and his sister says have a safe trip. Kale replies saying thanks, I will see you when I get back. She replies okay. After saying goodbyes Kale gets ready and comes to the carriage. He opens the door and terrifies while saying what the hell? He see the kittens sitting inside with Hans. He thinks how come their seat is better than mine. Hans rubs them and says my lord. They must have a comfortable ride, don't you agree? He says that they're innocent little babies. Kale looks at him and laughs with disapproval. He thinks that Hans is doting over them because he doesn't know that they can create fog and spray poison. Ron says I will ride next to the coachman, my lord. Kale says okay and is about to enter the carriage. In the meanwhile Choi Han come and stops him saying Lord Kale. Kale sighs and stops and says what? Choi Han questions are you sure you don't want me in the same carriage? What if something happens? Kale replies I am sure while thinking and looking at him that there is no need for that. Choi Han nods and says I see, while thinking how strange. He turns and start walking. Kale looks at him and thinks his eyes are still filled with rage and vengeance. I can tell he hasn't given up. Kale says I remember him being like this in the novel when he traveled with Vic Ross, Rosalind, and Lark. He's holding a lot of, but appears calm on the outside. Kale thinks that I guess it's not a bad thing. Meanwhile he hears Kochman saying to Choi Han that I think that you're in the wrong seat, man. Kale ponders at them. Choi Han thinks I guess there is a bully in every town, including this one. Kale starts stepping into the carriage while thinking that it won't be long before he realizes that he was wrong about Choi Han. Kale sits in the carriage and Kochman comes. He says my lord. Shall we get going? Kale says yes let's go. And the coachman slams the door. The carriage starts moving and there are sounds of horse hoofs striking to the roads. Kale is looking outside from the window and thinks that should I have Hans purchase the gifts. Kale remembers the time when he had a conversation with the siblings. Kale questions them do you want me to get you something from the capital? Lily gasps and says you will do that? Kale thinks that I knew it, they want presents. Lily tells him please, get me a sword. Kale gets surprised and thinks a sword? You're 7. Kale questions her are you sure? Besson tells him that Lily's dream is to become a swordsman. Kale starts thinking that well, everyone in this family has long limbs and a balanced body. He looks at Lily and thinks Lily is tall for her age. He thinks that I am sure she will be able to achieve her dream if she puts in the time and effort. Kale says that alright, it suits you. He tells her that I will buy you an expensive sword. Lily smiles and gets happy and thanks Kale. Kale questions Besson, what would you like? He replies a fountain pen. Kale replies okay. There is huge sound and carriage stops. Kale looks outside and says why did we stop? There are many people standing outside. One says you must pay a toll to pass through this mountain. He says hand over everything you have. Kale thinks that just like in the novel, we ran into a group of bandits. He says that do they not see the mark of the Hernandez family on my carriage? The girl kitten sighs and says I guess not. The boy kitten humphs and says fools. Ron knocks at the door and says my lord, I think we will have to stop for a while. He says that there seem to be a lot of rabbits. He also says that but they are little different from the ones I intend to catch for you. Ron laughs and says of course, I will not be the one to catch these rabbits. Kale looks at him and thinks he is scarier than the bandits. The door clicks. Kale looks at the sky and says a day and a half. He thinks that we are a day and a half away from reaching the village with the black dragon. Ron serves the food and says today's dinner is rabbit stew. Kale looks at it and says damn it. Kale says that Ron didn't catch rabbits. Choi Han stares him and thinks that why did he have to hunt rabbits? The 2 kittens comes in Kale's feet. One is saying if you don't want it, give it here. And other is saying give it to me. Meanwhile Hans come and says my little kittens, I prepared some jerky for you. Would you like some? He says that it's a healthy, unsalted snack with no artificial seasoning. Kale glimpses at him. While Choi Han is eating his meal silently. Today Kale's men had to fight dozens of bandits. Of course, the best fighter was none other than Choi Han. The coachman knocks at the carriage door and says, "My lord, the bandits have been dealt with." Choi Han comes and says, "We had a light skirmish." The coachman terrifies and Choi Han says, "Yes, it was a piece of cake." Kale smirks while looking at them and thinks he's got the guts to beat up the son of Count. Of course he wouldn't let anyone look down on him. Ron comes to Kale and says, "You really touched your food, my lord." He questions, "Have you lost your appetite?" Kale looks at him and says, "Yes, I have." He thinks that I guess this old bastard enjoy making fun of me. Choi Han questions, "Do you have a stomachache, my lord?" Kale replies, "No, I'm fine." Kale thinks that I'm willing to eat anything but these rabbits. Choi Han looks at Kale and says, "Lord Kale." Choi Han is staring at Kale. Kale questions, "What are you looking at?" Choi questions, "Was that your first battle?" Kale says, "What battle? Are you talking about the bandits?" Choi says, "Yes, my lord." Kale replies, "Yes, it was." He also says that I have never seen so many bandits in life. Choi nods and say, "I see." He says that I suppose it was your first near-death experience, then. Kale smirks and thinks, "My first near-death experience? You have no idea how nervous I've been because of you." Kale glances at Ron and Vic Ross and thinks, "Not only that, I have also been nervous because of Ron, who cackled at the rabbits you had caught." He also thinks about Vic Ross and says, "Vic Ross, who was sharpening his knife next to me." Kale takes a deep breath and thinks, "Because I'm surrounded by these people, I'm scared to death all the time." He pushes the food away and says, "I have totally lost my appetite." Choi Han comes near to him and says, "Lord Kale." He replies, "What?" Choi says, "The first time is the hardest." He also questions, "Do you practice martial arts?" Kale replies, "I don't need to." Choi questions, "Don't you think you should have some way to protect yourself?" Kale says, "I have plenty of protection." He points towards his people and says, "Don't you see all those men? They're all here to ensure my safety." He puts his hand on high heart and says, "And that's not all, I trust my heart." He grins and says, "I will survive." He thinks that of course, I will, because I have the shield to protect me. He further thinks that obviously, I will need to avoid warriors like Choi Han. Choi seems clueless. The kittens are meowing in Kale's feet. Kale says, "What's wrong with them?" Choi turns and says, "Then I shall go practice my swordsmanship." Kale says, "But you just ate." Choi grips his sword and says, "I must grow stronger." Kale gets chills and thinks, is he trying to destroy the planet or something? He thinks what a scary guy he is. While he is thinking, Vikra serves him good food saying, "Enjoy, my lord." Kale takes it and says thanks. Ron steps towards him and says, "When you don't have an appetite, sour food like lemonade can help you, my lord." Kale ignores and starts eating. A man shouts and says, "Everyone listen up." He shouts, "If you're all done with dinner, our evening training session will begin shortly." Kale looks at him and thinks, trying to keep up with Choi Han. The carriage is moving. Kale says, "Only 3 days left." He thinks that in 3 days, the Black Dragon will start its rampage. This piece of land next to Hennitas County belongs to a Viscount's family. They own a vacation home at the foot of the mountain that sits to the right of the village. And the Black Dragon is trapped inside a nearby cave. Kale further thinks that the house may belong to the Viscount, but he is a loyal servant of Marquis Sten. The Marques's second son, Vignan, who became the heir by crippling his older brother, also visit the palace from time to time. While thinking about him, Kale thinks that if that psycho hadn't tortured the dragon out of boredom, this area wouldn't have been in danger if getting wiped out. Kale sighs and Hans flinch looking at him. Hans says, "My lord, you must be tired. Mr. Choi and I will go find an inn right away." Kale says, "Sure." Hans says that it won't take long. They stop and Hans is talking with Choi. Kale calls Choi Han, he says yes. Kale says, "Make it quick." Choi smiles and says, "Yes, my lord. We will be back soon." Kale thinks that his reaction is making me feel iffy. Kale thinks that it's like I have handed him a poisoned apple with sweaty hands. After this, the carriage starts moving. An old man is crossing the road. Choi Han rushes and runs to save him from getting hit by the carriage. Kale thinks that I hate tropes like this. Choi reaches to the old man, grabs him and save him from getting hit by the carriage. Kale steps out of the carriage. The coachman asks, my lord, are you going to go yourself? Kale replies, yes, who else is there but me? He tells him that it's him, you typical authoritative aristocrat, Vinian Sten. Kale thinks about him and says he was also my typical villain in The Birth of a Hero. The coachman of Vinian comes and questions Choi, how dare you block the path of a nobleman's carriage? Choi replies saying, what, you almost run someone over, and besides he didn't block anything. You were driving recklessly. The coachman replies he should have made way for the nobleman's carriage. He also says it was that stupid commoner's fault. Vinian pats his shoulder and says that is enough. Hans whispers and says, I think Mr. Choi is very mad. Kale pats Choi Han's shoulder and says, you too, that is enough. He says, but my lord, they could have gone around that man, but they didn't. How do you expect me to let this go? Kale replies to Choi Han, calm down. Both come in front of each other and Kale notices Vinian's sleeve. He thinks that looks like some blood got on it while he was watching the dragon get tortured. Vinian smirks and says, pleased to meet you. Are you part of the Henadus family? Kale looks at him and thinks so he knows who I am. Kale replies, yes, pleased to meet you, Lord Vinian. While looking at him, Kale calls him crazy bastard in his mind. Vinian says, I heard that there was a bit of a free soul in the Henadus family. He questions, are you the one who had Lord Besson Henadus take over for you these past 2 years? Kale thinks that he already knows the answer, why bother asking me? Kale replies, yes, I am the famous lout, the baddest of the bad, if you will. Vinian smiles and says, you are a funny man. While looking at that old man, he says, an unexpected inconvenience delayed my schedule a bit, but I suppose it wasn't a total waste of time since we got to say hello and get acquainted, Lord Kale. Vinian says while smiling and looking at Choi Han, but your attendant needs to be educated on the difference between those who can run on this land and those who should stop. That old man trembles and says, forgive me, my lord. Vinian grins and Kale says the people of each territory resemble the aristocratic family that rules over their land. Because the Viscount of this territory took after the qualities of his mater, the Marquis of Sten, he is snobbish and authoritative. Kale questions, is that all, Lord Vinian? He replies, I believe so. Kale sits down and thinks Choi Han beats Vinian to a pulp is none of my business, but I can't have him beat up aristocrats in front of other people while he is working for me. Kale pats the old man and says, hey old man. The old man flinches and says yes. Gate stands and questions, is there a bar around here? Kale replies, where can I get a drink? He says, I can't start my day without drinking the night before, to lead the way. After this, Kale come to Lord Vinian and says, anyways, it was nice meeting you, Lord Vinian. While Vinian is staring at him, his coachman says, my lord, we are running late. Vinian looks at him and says it is rude to interrupt conversation between aristocrats. He smiles while shaking his hand and says, well, I'll be off. After this they release their hands and Kale thinks that was a pretty brief handshake. Kale says, if we run into each other at the capital city, let's have a drink. He further says, you seem like a great person. Kale also says that I would expect nothing less from the future Marquis of Sten. Vinian turns and says, it was a delight, Lord Kale. You seem to be a free spirit, see you again. After this they went away. Kale smirks while looking at them and thinks, no, I don't intend to ever see him again. He says, even if I do, I will make sure it is from a distance. Kale pats the shoulder of Choi Han and says half of all aristocrats are like him. Kale looks at the man and sits down and says, why are you still on the ground? Did you hurt your legs? Kale says, Choi Han, you saved this man's life, so please take him home safely. The man says, no, there is no need, I will take you to a bar, my lord. Kale replies, it is fine, I will pass. He further says, I'm not in the mood. The man replies, I sell liquor, my lord. Kale questions him, you are a bar owner? The man tells him that it is the only inn in this town. He says, we serve both liquor and food. Kale calls Hans while thinking that if it is the only inn in town, it must be the best one, I guess. Kale orders Hans to ask him for direction and lead the way. Choi Han comes to him and says, Lord Kale. Kale replies, yes. Choi Han questions, aren't you angry? Kale replies about what? Kale says that he was disrespectful to me? Or that he gave me ridiculous advice about how to handle you? He further says or that he called that old man an inconvenience after almost killing him? Kale keeps saying that why is the old man apologizing to you? Give him a proper apology, is that what I should have said? Kale further tells him that I'm not that kind of person. Post-doc Kant says I don't want to say those things and I'm not angry. I have definitely reacted like that in the past. But not now. Kale says I have learned that this is the best way to navigate life. He says that given a bit to authority turned a bit of a blind eye to injustice, and live by my own rules within those lines. Kale grins and says if someone disrespects me or if something troubles me, I make sure to eventually get my revenge. Kale further says that Bastard is probably going to be kicked out of his house soon. Kale says that Bastard is probably going to be kicked out of his house soon. Choi Han says I beg your pardon. Kale grins and says because I'm going to steal his dragon. Meanwhile they reach the inn and the old man says this is our finest room, my lord. They enters the room and Kale says not bad. The old man says we have never had an aristocrat stay with us, I hope you can forgive our humble offerings. The old man is too nervous and anxious. While looking at him Kale thinks although there is nothing wrong with being polite, I get uncomfortable when someone is too polite. Kale pats his shoulder and says hey old man, I don't like it when people abuse themselves in front of me. He says travelers stay here on their way to and from Anitos, it is a perfectly fine establishment. The man says my lord, are the people of Henitus as kind as you? Kale smiles and says don't be ridiculous, I am the biggest loud in the county. Kale turns and says most people have a better personality than me. Kale says now get back to your work. The man bows and went away. Kale thinks that bow, did he not understand what I just said? Suddenly someone knocked at the door. Kale while taking off his coat says come in. Hans come in and says my lord, this is all you wanted right? Kale replies yes, give it to me. Hans extend the box towards him and is staring at it. Kale thinks that it looks like he really wants to know what is inside. Kale says a butler should not let his emotions show. He replies actually, a butler should be completely transparent with his master. Kale says you're a funny guy, aren't you? He replies I am, my lord. Kale says get out. He replies yes sir. Before leaving he questions will we be staying here for about 3 days, my lord? Kale replies yes, I will leave it to you to handle everything. He says understood. Kale taps the box while thinking other than Ron Hans is the most comfortable with me. He says he's afraid of me but he doesn't let that bother him, he has got a lot of guts. The girl kitten questions what is inside that box. The boy kitten says I wanna know. Kale opens the box and says this will save a poor beast, mess with a rude man, and help protect me. Kale remembers the time when he was in the library with Bilos. Bilos questions my lord, what do you need this for? Kale replies I don't have to explain myself to you. Bilos replies I see, but if you are looking to purchase the whole batch it will cost you quite a fortune. Kale replies can I rent them? Bilos laughs and says of course you can, since you are a special customer. Bilos further says because they can't be rented out to civilians, I had to use my name to rent 2 of them, so please meet me at the capital city and return them to me in person. Kale replies sure I will do that. Now Kale is having a ball-like thing in his hand. The girl kitten questions what is it? Kale lifts it and says it is a mana orbit confusion apparatus. He further says it cost me millions of galleons. The kitten flinch and says wow. Kale tells them I spent 20 million just to rent them. He further says that with this device I can disable all the video saving apparatuses of one mountain. But I have to install this a day before and wait, and once activated, the device will only work for 40 minutes. While looking at it Kale smiles and thinks it is an awfully expensive little ball, but I like that it won't break easily. He rolls the ball on the floor and the kitten that's it. Kale stands and questions can you read a map? The girl kitten replies of course we can, we were the heirs of the Mist Cat tribe. The boy kitten says yes she is right. Kale unfurls the map and says this is where we are right now. He questions do you see this mountain? Before this is if you go to the east of it you will see a house, but don't go near it, make sure to stay out of sight. Kale further says that anyway, behind the house is a cave and we are going to break a mistreated kid, get out of there. The boy kitten questions a kid? Kale replies yep, he is younger than you. The boy kitten questions he is younger than me. Kale replies yes, he is 4 years old. The girl kitten raises his hand and questions, so we are going to save his life. Kale replies no, we are just going to get him out. He ties the ball in a little bag and says, so go there in your cat form and bury this ball in the mountain. He ties the ball in the girl kitten's neck. She questions, where should we bury it? Kale glances out of the window and says anywhere will do. The girl kitten questions, anywhere? He replies yes. The boy kittens say sounds like a piece of cake. The girl kitten replies yeah, I mean we even managed to run away from our elders. Kale nods his head and says I'm sure it will be easy, I wouldn't be asking if I didn't think you could do it. Kale opens the window and say, when you come back I will give you steak as much as you want. The kittens hop out of window and start running. Kale smiles. Kale and Choi Han are sitting on a table and having meal. Kale takes a sip and thinks this lemonade is growing on me. Choi Han questions, is something wrong, my lord? Kale, while putting the cup on the table, says, have you ever seen a dragon? Choi Han questions, a dragon? Kale replies yes. Choi Han says, I have seen something similar. Kale replies, does the weird monsters in the dark forest look like dragons? What did you think? Choi Han replies, it was a monster. Kale question, in what way? Choi Han replies, in its appearance and behavior. Kale again questions, is that so? He further says that then you have never seen anything close to a dragon. Choi Han says, I'm sorry. Kale explains, dragons are like people. Dragons, beastmen, dwarfs, elves all feel things like we do and have their own lives. He keeps speaking and says, but what if a being like that has been trapped in darkness since its birth? What if it's never seen the sun? What if a small flicker of light is all it has? He keeps questioning and says, can you imagine living like that? While tapping the table with his finger, Kale keeps speaking and says it is forced to become something that is incapable of rational thinking and endure loneliness without being able to depend on family or friends. Choi Han seems to be in great anger. While Kale keeps on speaking and says it is barely able to sustain its existence after being tortured and abused every day. Choi Han is silent while Kale thinks, that is what I thought. Of course he is furious, he's got a big heart. While lifting the cup, Kale further says, and that poor beast is somewhere nearby. Looking at Choi Han, Kale thinks that did the story of the abused dragon tip him over the edge? Choi Han gives a serious glance and questions, are you going to rescue it, my lord? Kale replies, are you insane? Why would I do that? While sliding the cup, Kale says that it was abused by humans, there is no way in hell it will come along with me. He further says that I'm sure it is full of distress and anger. Kale explains that besides, I heard that dragons think they are superior to other beings and that they are born arrogant. Kale further tells him that most importantly, if I raise the dragon I have a feeling that I'm going to get mixed up in something complicated. Kale further says that there are only about 20 dragons in total in both the eastern and western continents. So if I were to take one, I would be telling everyone that I intend to stir up trouble. Choi Han questions, what then? Kale replies, what do you mean? He says, isn't it obvious? Kale says the dragon must be free to live its own life. Choi Han says, so should I go save the dragon, my lord? Kale stands and says, yes, you should go help. Choi Han twinkles and says, I'm ready, I am ready to do anything you ask, my lord. Kale smiles and says, take it down a notch, I don't want to kill anyone if I can help it. He further says that let's just take care of this quietly. Choi Han says, hence I knew you were different. Kale ignores his words and says, tell Ron to set a table for me on the first floor. Kale is drinking while Choi and Hans are setting. Choi Han stares at him and whispers, shouldn't we stop him? He has had a lot to drink. Hans replies, nope, he is not holding anything. He laughs and says he promised not to throw any bottles, which means we are safe. Kale steps to the old man and says, Have, you have some good stuff here. He says that it is better than I expected. The man replies, it is a local drink made with fruits and herbs from the mountains, my lord. He says that is why it is a little expensive. Kale, while lifting the bottle, says, do you have more? He replies, yes, we have many more bottles. Kale orders him then serve it to all my fine attendants. The coachman says, my lord, you don't need to. Kale lifts him and says, just drink up, I want to buy you guys a drink. Kale waves at Choi Han and calls him. He says that I don't think anything dangerous is gonna happen here. He further says that I feel bad for the guards on duty, but everyone else should take a day off when they can. Kale is wobbling and says I'm tired, let's go. Kale and Choi Han are stepping up the stairs. Kale looks at Ron and thinks this old man probably doesn't care what I do, but he won't like getting mixed up in this, so I should tell him. Kale says, Ron, I'm going to go out for a bit. He further says don't tell anyone, okay? Ron grins and says all right, my lord. He says I will be waiting. Kale replies don't wait up. Kale glances at them and says Hans and Ron, I'm off to bed, so don't wake me unless there is an emergency. Kale glared at them and says you know what I am like when you wake me up in the middle of the night, right? Hans smiles and says yes my lord, we know. He further says good night. Ron bows down and says I will wait out here my lord. Kale says to Choi Han you should get going, too. I don't need your help anymore. Choi Han replies yes, my lord. Kale leans down and whispers in his ear and says climb in through the window once the sun goes down. Choi Han nods his head. As the sun goes down the girl kitten asks should we go now? Meanwhile Choi Han steps in from the window and says Lord Kale? Choi Han hopes in the room and says Lord Kale. Kale tosses something towards him and says put this on. Choi Han catches it and questions what is this? Kale replies what does it look like? It is the mysterious organization's uniform. The design and seal were described in detail in The Birth of a Hero. He thinks in his mind that probably because the organization ran into so much trouble with Choi Han. I made this uniform based on that description. Kale wears the shirts himself and thinks it is a little shabby, but it will look pretty real from a distance. He further says I bet people only remember the star anyway. Choi Han questions are we going to do something bad? Kale looks suspicious and replies yes, very bad. He grins and says very bad for Vinian Sten. Choi Han replies then I will also need a mask, my lord. Kale gives him the mask while thinking I guess even a nice guy like him hates certain people and wants to see them suffer. He further thinks that this is a guy who lived alone for decades and only recently joined society. He is just shy of turning 18 years old. The cat starts meowing. Kale tells him that these cats are from the cat tribe, they are anthropomorphic beasts. Choi Han bows down towards them. Kale tells them hey guys, this is Choi Han. He further says here we have On and Hong. Kale says that is it for introduction. He orders now, let's get ready. They all jumps out of the room and the watch is ticking. Kale looks at it and orders let's go. They all start running very fast. While Kale is saying that the alarm of a top-class magic device is going off, which means the voice changer is working properly and the hidden ball is doing its job too. At the same time there are voices of some people coming. Kale says maybe not all of them are top class though I don't hear too many of them fully. Choi Han hits one of them and he falls down. The other man while fighting with Choi Han questions who are you, how dare you come here? Both of them are fighting with their swords and Choi Han makes the other man fall down on the ground too. Then suddenly there are more people and they says what is going on? Kale says fog. And the girl kitten leaves and suddenly there is fog everywhere. The man on the other side questions what the hell, where is this fog coming from? They saw Kale standing in front of them. Kale glances at them and says protect. Choi Han stands in front of Kale for protection, the leader from the other side shouts stop them. The man seems confused and says he just disarmed 2 men, is he a sword master? Choi Han knocks them all in one swing. Kale looks at him and thinks he knocked them out with a single swing. The man runs towards Choi Han saying who the hell are you guys? Choi Han gives him a stroke from his sword and says quiet. Kale says I will leave you to it. While fighting to those people Choi Han says no one shall pass this point. Vinian looks at the crystal and questions why isn't this stupid crystal working? He feels someone standing behind him, he gasps and turns. He starts taking steps and starts trembling. He says who are you? Stay back. He also says you have no idea what is in here. Kale thinks yes, I'm sure you're scared. He further says that the book said that Vinian strapped a self-destruct bomb on the torturer in case of a break-in. Kale raises his hands and thinks that if the bomb goes off, I'll get caught in the blast, too. Vinian pants and says go away. He can't breath properly, he just got to says poison. And he fell down on the ground. Kale steps towards him and see the key. He grabs it and lift it thinking this must be the key. The kittens come and Kale says well done. Kale steps in and he sees the dragon. He says there it is. Kale looks at the dragon who is lying on the floor with closed eyes. Kale thinks this place reeks of blood. He opens the door and says hey. There is silence. Kale slips down his mask and says let's get you out of here. The dragon opens his eyes. Kale looks at him and thinks I like that look. The kittens are with Vinian and the boy kitten touches his hand and says it's about time. The girl kitten repeats his word. And suddenly Kale comes out taking the dragon in his arms. He puts him on the floor, politely. Girl kittens looks and says it must hurt a lot. The boy kitten looks dragon and calls him poor thing, it must hurt. Kale says I know. Just stay put. He stares the dragon and thinks I was going to use the healing potion that I brought anyway. While looking at dragon's collar he thinks that but I need to get that mana control collar off of him first. Otherwise the potion won't take full effect. Kale starts walking and bumps into Vinian. He says he is still in the way. The dragon seems a little angry. Kale taps the wall while thinking that the escape route that Vinian made must be here somewhere. He keeps thinking that according to the book, Vinian had a clapping fear of intruders, so he created a way out of this palace. He slides his hand on the wall and thinks it's a secret passageway that even his tortures don't know about. He says a particularly flat section of the wall is where the exit is located. Kale is standing in front of the wall and says here it is. He says that the book said we can get out by applying the right amount of pressure. Kale hears sound of footsteps. He turns and Choi Han is coming. Kale questions did you get everything done? He replies yes, my lord. Choi Han looks at the dragon and Vinian. Choi Han slips down his mask and says I did everything you asked me to. He says that I let the menial laborers away and left the fighters immobilized. Kale says good job. Kale while knocking at a spot orders Choi Han to punch this spot. He questions I'm sorry, should I use full force? Kale while thinking in mind that would make the whole Dave collapse says no, don't go overboard. He further says imagine punching a 10 centimeters hole into the wall. Choi replies so I should hit lightly. Kale replies yes, lightly. Kale shifts from there and thinks I can't even punch this wall without hurting myself. Choi Han throws a punch on the wall and it breaks. The kitten seems amazed and says wow. Kale picks the dragon while ignoring everything else. Choi Han picks a stick with fire to see. The kittens hops on him. Kale orders let's go. Choi Han replies yes my lord. They comes out of that place safely. Kale is holding the dragon. The dragon glimpses at Kale. Kale puts it down and says stop staring me, I'm helping you. While looking at him Kale thinks what a stubborn little thing. He also thinks that Vinian probably tortured him for 4 whole years. He says I personally like this dragon. Kim Roxu was an orphan who eventually gave in, but this guy is different. The dragon peeks at him. Kale while picking a cutter says hey. And steps towards the dragon, he grabs the collar and cuts it. The dragon squeezes his eyes and then opens it. The collar and dragon are on the ground. The dragon glances at Kale. Kale questions him what are you looking at? Kale gives Choi Han gloves saying use these to pick up the collar, it might shock you. Choi Han takes the gloves and wear them. The dragon is looking at them. Kale takes out the bottle and open it. Kale sits down and says do you know how much money I've spent on you? The dragon hesitates, Kale grabs his face and make him drink that. The dragon remembers the time when he used to be injected by Vinian. Kale says I hope you get better soon, you stubborn little thing. The dragon gulps all the potion. After that there is a glow, shine and his wounds gets clear. The dragon stare at Kale. Kale questions him what do you want to do now? Kale says that you're a smart arrogant dragon. He tells that I know you can speak the human language, so answer me. He questions again what will you do once you're free? The dragon replies, I will live. He says that I'll be free, I don't want to be tamed. Kale replies, then do that, dragons should be free. Kale says, I'm not going to raise you. The dragon get jolted and says, liar. He says that humans always lie. Kale replies, true, I'm definitely a good liar. Kale stands and says, but you should live the life you want. He grins while looking at the dragon and says, be free. After saying this, they all starts moving towards the inn. While walking, Kale thinks that I think I've done everything I wanted to do. He thinks that I messed with Vinian and saved the town from a mad dragon. Kale says let's go while Choi Han glimpses at the dragon. Kale thinks that and through this experience, Choi Han learned what it meant to be free. He keeps walking and says most importantly, I don't have to be responsible for a dragon. The dragon standing there watches them and says, I hate human. He looks at the bottle and says humans are bad. While they are walking, Hong says, Own, I think he's gonna follow us. Own replies, yeah, I think so too. They says, then are we gonna get a little brother? Kale laughs at them and says, what are you saying? He further says that dragons are independent beings and don't like to be owned. He further tells that one in particular probably has a deep hatred for humans because he was tortured. The kitten sighs and says, it seems we won't be getting a little brother. The moon is shining bright. Kale orders the kittens and says, go retrieve the ball you buried yesterday. Kale pats Choi Han's shoulder and says, you did a good job. He looks at him and thinks Choi Han saved something for the first time today. He thinks that although he fought a group of bandits the other day, that was more to protect someone rather than save them. Choi Han, while looking at Kale, remains silent. Kale releases his shoulder while thinking that I guess the story changed a little, since he ended up saving the dragon instead of the town. Choi Han says, Lord Kale. Kale smiles and questions, yes. Choi Han questions, what will you do if the dragon chooses to follow you? Kale gets chills and replies he wouldn't do that. Choi replies, but if he does, what then? Kale thinks, what if he follows me? He turns while saying, I don't worry about things that haven't happened yet or things that have already happened. Choi Han, while seeing him walking alone, says, don't go off alone, my lord. It's dangerous. Kale glances at him and keep moving and says, no way. They reach the inn. And Kale is sleeping. Suddenly the dragon appears in the window and in his hand he have that bottle. The next morning Kale and Choi Han are sitting together on the table and having breakfast. Kale is gulping the drink and puts the cup on the table. Kale hagged and says, I had so much going yesterday that I didn't notice, but all that drinking is catching up to me. He says, I didn't sleep well last night either, it felt like someone was watching me. Kale questions, did you clean up? Choi Han replies, yes, I erased our tracks and made a fake trail to the west. Kale yawns and replies, nice work. Choi Han says, but Lord Kale, we'll be arriving another city in a few days. He questions, that is the halfway point you mentioned? Kale replies, yes, the next city is Pertile. He says we will be parting ways there. Kale further explains that it took us a while to get through the mountain, but from here on out, the roads lead straight to the capital city, so it shouldn't take too long. Choi Han nods his head. He says, Lord Kale. Kale questions, what is it? He replies, I actually went back to check on the Sten's family vacation home. Kale says, and? Choi Han further replies saying the place was a mess, many knights and guards were leaving their posts. Kale gets annoyed and says they were probably on their way to report their superiors. Choi Han says, but also. Kale order him to get to the point. He tells that the secret passageway we had taken was completely demolished. The kittens gasps and Choi Han further tells that the trees, grass, soil, everything around it was in ruins. Kale replies, must have been the dragon. He stands and says at least he hasn't murdered anyone there yet. He further says he's probably holding back because he's young and scared. Kale grins and thinks I'm sure he tore down the escape route to block anyone from coming out and destroyed the surrounding area to dismantle all the magic apparatuses. Kale says that dragons are sensitive to mana, after all he's pretty smart for a 4-year-old. Choi Han gets amazed and says I was aware that mana was powerful but. While he is speaking Kale interrupts and says do not underestimate dragons. He waves his hand and says anyway, that will be all for now, you may go. Choi Han replies yes, my lord. As he stands up to go, Kale questions, are you going to sleep until we have to leave? Choi Han turns and says no, I have to go help Vic Ross. Kale says it looks like you guys have become close. Choi scowls and says no, we are not close, my lord. Kale replies I see. He thinks that I've never seen that look on his face. Choi Han bows. Kale says on your way out, tell Hans to fix me a drink. Choi Han halts and says pardon. Kale glances at the clock and says haven't you heard of drinking to get over a hangover? Choi Han is walking down the stairs and he suddenly stops. Kale looks at him and says why is he just standing there? Two knights are standing and talking to each other. Kale looks at them and thinks is that one the knights he knocked out yesterday? Kale bumps in his leg and questions what are you afraid of? Choi Han replies I should have made sure they were totally incapacitated for at least a day. He says I didn't expect them to recover so soon. Choi says it seems I underestimate their strength. He clenches his fist and says I will use greater force from now on. Kale sneaks out while thinking that's Choi Han, the main character of the story, who's willing to destroy everything in his path to obtain justice. Kale is sitting on the table. The old man steps having a bottle in his hand and says my lord, I've bought the same bottle from last night. Kale says hey, old man every time I see you, I think. The old twitches and says yes. Kale smirks and, he's a hell of a businessman. Kale says I am saying this as a compliment. He further says you have brought the perfect drink to cure my hangover. As he takes the bottle a man says we arrived yesterday and decided to have a few drinks after all the traveling. He further says so we all drank together and enjoyed a relaxing evening, no one left this in last night. Kale is looking at him silently, the man says I don't understand why people working for Marquis Stench want to know this information. The Marquis Sten Knight replies the Marques's vacation home was robbed, a few items were taken. He says so we are checking to see if something similar happened here. Kale swings the bottle and start drinking and thinks I guess a dragon thief is technically a thief, too. He slams the bottle on the table and shouts what are you looking at? The man tells the knight that Lord Kale can't start the day without drink that's why he is drinking. He further tells that it's the dog hair, he is great man who knows how to take care of a hangover. The knight replies oh how interesting. Man questions was that supposed to be a compliment? He says well, then I wish you all a safe journey. They starts moving away. Kale sighs while looking at them and thinks I think we are in clear. While looking at the bottle he thinks that now that they've seen the famous lout with their own two eyes, they'll never suspect me. He keeps that I mean, who would take me seriously? I'm an aristocrat who's drinking his way to the capital. Kale further thinks that even if Vinian finds out, he'll never know what that I was a thief since he won't be able to link me to the secret organization with stars. Kale closes his eyes and calls Ron. Ron comes and says yes, my lord. Kale replies bring me some honey lemon tea. He says I think it will help my hangover. Ron replies sure thing. Kale while drinking it says he won't be able to pin down the culprit no matter how closely he follows the tracks that were left behind. He smiles and remember Vinian face and says I bet he's fuming right now. Although Taylor Sten was the eldest son of the Sten family and its only sensible member he was ghost aside when his younger brother, Vinian, caused him to become paralyzed from the waist down. So he set out on a search for a power that could cure his condition. There was no mention of it anywhere. That didn't mean all was lost for him though a book that he came across in a shop for antique books gave him some clues, regeneration, and stone tower. Although he was only able to understand 2 words out of the whole book, he headed in the direction that the words seemed to be pointing to. The carriage is moving. The kitten questions no in tonight? Kale replies no from now on, we are going to be sleeping in tents from time to time. While looking out of the window he thinks in order to stay in Perthel for a long time, we will have to stick to a tight schedule. He says there is a reason why I must go there. He remembers his shield and says the city is home to another ancient power like my unbreakable shield. The energy of the heart. He further says about that the power that Taylor is looking for is in Perthel. Kale says if I can obtain that ability, my shield will become stronger. He also thinks that I feel bad for taking away Taylor's last hope, but I will have more use for it in the capital. He closes his eyes and further thinks Taylor probably thinks it is a power that specifically helps with regeneration and life, but what he doesn't know is that it won't have any effect on his already crippled body. Kale further says that if I let the original story play out, Taylor will gain the power and then fall into despair when he realizes that it doesn't work. Kale says the heart-earned ancient power will not be able to save his life from Vinyan. The girl kitten says Hans just told us that if you make a wish at a stone tower, it will come true. The boy kitten also says he also said the stone towers are pretty. They both twinkles and the girl kitten says you don't have to go if you don't want to, but we would like to make a visit. The boy kitten says we don't want to cause too much trouble, but we want to go with you. Kale questions what are you going to wish for? They reply for a little brother to come along with. While they were saying, Kale interrupts them and says denied. The carriage stops and Hans tells Kale, I guess we will be camping tonight. Kale comes out of the carriage and says I am tired. The next morning there is a sheep lying on the ground looking at that. Kale questions what is this question. Hans replies I think someone left it here for us, my lord. There is a specific sign and Kale looks at it and says it looks like a message left by someone who knows how to speak, but not write. He further thinks that I have a bad feeling about this. Choi Han seems pleased. Kale looks at him and thinks it must have been someone that Choi Han, who was on night watch duty yesterday, chose to ignore on purpose. Kale thinks that I guess it was the dragon. Kale turns while thinking I'm just going to pretend like I don't know anything. But the same thing happened again at their next camping site. Kale looks at it and thinks I thought he would give up if I ignored his message. And the one after that, the same thing happens with 2 rabbits. And again at the next camping site same happens. The same thing happened again and again. Kale is sitting in the carriage and thinks that dragon is relentless. He further thinks that he wouldn't follow us into the city, would he? Choi Han says isn't it cute? He is like a little kid, my lord. Kale thinks that kid is capable of blowing up a mountain. Are you still gonna think he's cute then? Kale takes a deep breath while thinking I thought he hated humans. I wanted him to grow his powers and put an end to the Sten family. Kale looks outside of the window and is thinking that would certainly bring more peace to the county of Hennetus. Both the kittens look outside of the window and are amazed. The boy kitten says every house has a pile of stones. The girl kitten says amazing. Kale replies yes, it is the city of stone towers. They come out of the carriage. Hans comes to Kale and Kale questions are we staying here? Hans replies yes, it is not yet time for the Stone Tower Festival so the rooms were inexpensive. Kale says it is strange they have that festival when the city doesn't even have an abundant supply of stones. They start moving while Hans says I know the reason why, my lord. He further says there is this sad but didactic story that has been passed down through the generations. Kale replies if it is long, don't bother. Hans didn't stop and keeps talking. He says this legend dates back to. While Hans is speaking, Kale interrupts and says are you listening to me? Hans points his finger and says the ancient times. Kale stands and while picking the glass he questions the ancient times. Hans replies yes my lord. Kale says all right, go on. Hans starts saying that long ago, this city was abandoned by the gods. Kale thinks the city of Perthel was abandoned by the gods. Kale thinks I have never heard this story before. Hans says the city was abandoned by the gods. Kale replies this is the first time I'm hearing about this. Hans say well, it is because you never studied history, my lord. Kale replies you sure seem to have an answer to anything. Kale points a finger towards him and says you are treading on thin ice okay? Hans laugh and say it is the job of a butler to inform his master of anything he doesn't know. Hans further says anyway, nobody knows why the city was cast aside. He further tells that but apparently, groups of people began to stack stones as a form of worship. Kale questions were their prayers answered? Hans replies no, none of their prayers were answered. He further tells that is why there are no temples in Perthel, my lord. Kale says because they don't feel they need to serve the gods that abandon them. Hans says bravo, sir. You are so smart that you don't need any schooling. Kale gets angry and says watch it Hans. Hans keeps on talking and says anyway, that is why this city has stone towers instead of temples. He further says the stacked stones later came to represent a promise, my lord. He also tells Kale that a promise between people and also a promise with oneself. Kale questions what kind of promise. Hans raised his finger and says a person who has made their wish come true shall topple their own stone tower. Kale, while looking at the coin in his hand, says, what an interesting city. Han says, isn't it, my lord? He further says the people here must make their own wishes come true instead of looking to the heavens. Kale, while stacking the coins, questions, make your own wish come true. So the act of toppling over a mount of stones symbolizes overcoming an obstacle. Kale says that so the stacked stones aren't actually a form of worship? Hans replies no, they do it as a promise to themselves. Kale says then I guess the gods don't grant wishes. Hans replies correct, it is a little sad that they were abandoned, but in some ways it is a hopeful story. Kale says Hans. Hans replies yes. Kale tells him to look below. As Hans looked down, the kittens were looking at him with upset faces. Hans questions, why are my little baby so upset? He further says, should I bring you some jerky? He gets panic and questions again, you don't want jerky? While looking at them, Kale thinks, I don't think they're hungry. He remembers the time when the kittens told him that what Hans just told them about the stone tower. Hans questions, my precious babies, shall I go get you some treats? While looking at the kittens being angry, he smiles and says, please don't be angry. He glares at Kale and questions, may I be excused, my lord? He replies, you can excuse yourself for the rest of the night. Hans turns and says, I'll be just a minute. Kale is drinking, and in the meanwhile he calls Ron and says, you should go get some rest, too. Ron questions, is Choi Han leaving in 2 days, my lord? Kale replies yes. Kale further asks him, why do you ask? Do you not want him to leave? Would you like to join him? Ron smiles and says, how could I possibly leave you, my lord? He says, I like staying by your side. He just got chills. Ron says, it is just I thought it would be more beneficial if he continued to travel with us. He further says that I should get more acquainted with him before he leaves. He further says that Vikros will be disappointed. Kale replies, well, the three of you will be reunited at the capital soon and eventually travel together. Kale says that then you can all head over to Rosalind Kingdom. Sounds great, right? By looking at Ron, Kale thinks you would better say yes. Ron replies, I look forward to all of us spending time together, my lord. Ron smiles and says, all I want is for us to arrive safely at our destination. Kale puts his hand on his head and thinks, does he expect me to believe that? I know he is incapable of feeling such things, and orders him, you may go now. Ron now downs and leave. The kittens are in a bad mood and saying Hans is a liar. They say we trusted him. While listening to them, Kale thinks that I heard that the old man lived to be 150. An ancient power left behind by a man who died of old age. The energy of the heart. Kale rise and thinks he thought his powers was a curse. Kale starts walking towards the door. As he opened the door, he finds Hans in front of him. Hans gasps and says, Lord Kale? Kale tugs his coat and says, let's go see some stone towers. He further says, just you, me, Choi Han and On and Hong will go. Hans smiles and thinks the 150-year-old man wanted to go somewhere with strong winds to stack his stones. A place where the winds converged. Kale pats his shoulder and says, so get ready. Kale thinks that man worked on his tower for over 100 years, but never finished it. What did he so desperately want? He further thinks whatever his wish was, I don't really care. He says, I'm going to check the place out. Kale says, if I'm going to build a stone tower, I'm going to make it look great. The sun is shining bright. They all reach the place. The steps in, and Kale thinks the sun is bit strong during the day. While everyone is walking forward, Kale stops and is looking at someone. He thinks, I figured he would still be here. That's the Marquis of Sten's eldest son, Taylor, and Kag, a high priestess. Kale glances at them and thinks, I came here to check the place with the stone towers, but also to catch a glimpse of them as well. He further thinks all I had to go off was a description of what they looked like. Taylor questioned Kage, why did you want to come here? She replies, I don't know if the gods gave me a sign or what, but I kept having the same weird dream over and over again. She tells that I was told to come here to meet our Savior. She further says that the god of death told me that even he can't predict our Savior's next move. Taylor replies, I thought the gods could foresee everything. Kage says, I guess not, half of what they say makes 0 sense anyway. Taylor replies, don't be like that, it's still a message from the gods. He further says also, no one's supposed to know that you can hear voices. Kage says, who cares? There are no priests in Perthel. She also says, and a message from the gods? Please. She questions, do they put food on my table? She replies herself saying no. She further questions, do you seriously believe that a savior will magically appear before people like us? Taylor sighs and says, Kage. I'm hungry, let's go. Taylor says, I'm craving beer right now. She replies, I'm craving some smoked pork. And they starts laughing. Taylor points a spot and says, sounds like the perfect combination. He says, let's go. My treat. Kage replies, all right. I'll take you there right away. And they starts moving. Kale looks at them going and thinks, now I know their faces. He further thinks, and since they don't know me, all I have to do is avoid them. Hans comes and says, my lord. He whispers and says, I just saw the Marquis of Sten's eldest son. Kale turns to him and says, how did you know it was him? Hans taps his head and says, I have every aristocratic family memorized in my head, my lord. He further says that the man was in a wheelchair that had the symbol of the Sten household, a red snake. Kale says that, Hans, you really don't look it, but you're actually very competent. Hans says, you're too kind, what will you do next? Kale says, ignore them. Kale looks at the stacked stones and thinks, is this it? It doesn't look special at all. He further thinks that I wasn't expecting anything aesthetic, but there's really nothing notable about this place. The girl kitten says, I'm kinda disappointed. The boy kitten says, they're not pretty. Choi Han steps forward. Kale, while looking at him, thinks that, is he going to make a wish? Choi sits on the floor. Kale thinks that, I bet he wants to return to his hometown. He further thinks that Choi Han is different from me, Kim Raksu. He further thinks that he grew up in a happy family surrounded by positive influences. He says that's how he could survive such a terrible event and retain his goodness. Choi Han turns to him and says, Lord Kale. Kale replies, yes. Choi Han says, I have a question for you and also something to tell you. Kale looks at him and thinks, why am I getting a bad feeling about this? Kale says, all right, ask me the question first. Kale questions, aren't you going to make a wish? Kale thinks, I don't expect that. Kale replies, I don't make wishes. Choi says, why not? Kale replies, because they get your hopes up. Kale further explains that it's better not to have any expectations. He says, if you gamble and win, you're happy to get 50 coins for 10. He further says, but if you wanted 50 and you only get 10, you'll feel disappointed and annoyed. Hans pats Kale's shoulder and says, you're right, my lord. He says this world is devoid of hopes or dreams. Kale says, just go look around the place. He replies, yes sir. He go away taking the kittens with him. Kale shakes his head. Choi Han says, and now, my report. He says, the dragon followed us into the palace, my lord. Kale replies, just ignore it. Choi says, okay. Kale shifts and glances at the place while thinking that, did that dragon really follow us all the way here? He turns and says, let's go, and they starts moving from the place. There is a footprint on the sand. And the dragon is there. The next day Kale decides to visit the grave of the man who lived to be 150. Kale says, I will only be taking Choi Han with me. While looking at all of them, he thinks since he is the most skilled fighter, no one else will feel the need to come along. He further thinks I should really go alone, but I know they won't let me. The knight turns and says, all right, my lord. Hans also turns and runs while saying, then I'll go take care of the lovely kittens. Kale, while looking at him, thinks it is like he was waiting for this. Kale and Choi Han are walking. Choi Han says, Lord Kale, what are you up to this time? Kale turns and replies, this time? You make it sound like I'm up to no good every day. Kale points at a spot and says, anyway, I have some business to take care of up in that mountain. He further says, all you have to do is wait for me at the entrance. Choi Han replies, understood, my lord. Kale starts moving and he thinks I feel comfortable bringing him along because he doesn't ask a lot of questions. Suddenly Choi Han says, Lord Kale. Kale replies, yes. Choi Han says, I will be leaving tomorrow. Kale replies, yes, I know, I'm the one who gave you the orders. Choi Han replies, I have given this a lot of thought, and I have decided to tell you the truth. Kale, while looking at him, thinks I guess this is what he really wanted to talk to me about, not the dragon. Kale says, all right, what is it? Choi Han says, Ron is a dangerous man. Kale startled at him and thinks I didn't expect him to cut right to the chase. He further thinks should I play dumb or act like I already knew. Kale replies is that so? Choi Han shouts and say why aren't you surprised? He further says he reeks of blood, my lord. He keeps on saying that he is very powerful and has a lot of blood on his hands. He further says at first, I thought you were keeping him around despite knowing all this. Kale keeps quiet while thinking if I had known, would have taken Ron with me to rescue the dragon but I didn't. He further thinks that means I either didn't know about him or didn't trust him. He thinks that but why would I have kept him by my side for 18 years if I didn't trust him? While saying all this he thinks which led Choi Han to come to the following conclusion, Lord Kale doesn't know the truth about Ron. Choi Han says but it seemed like no one knew about it. He further says that's why I felt the need to tell you, my lord. Kale shrugs and replies I had no idea Ron was such a powerful person. Choi Han replies he possesses a shadowy strength, my lord. Are you going to keep him around? Kale thinks of course not, I'm gonna send him off with you as soon as we get to the capital. Kale further says to me, you guys are the same. Choi Han says I am sorry. Kale tilts his neck and says so you said he's a dangerous man. So why did you leave him be? Choi Han says because and he can't answer the. Kale says that is right because he didn't do anything to you. Kale lifts his neck and says whatever the case may be, Ron has been my attendant for the past 18 years. Kale tells Choi Han that even when he walked proudly next to the authoritative vice captain or when he did Han's job for him neither of them got mad at Ron. The end of the day, he is added dictated servant of the Hannity family who carries out all his duties. Kale questions do you hate him? Choi Han replies no, my lord. Kale again questions then what is it? Choi Han says I just thought you should know that he is a dangerous man. Kale replies both you and Ron are the same to me. Kale further says that by your logic you also pose a threat to me since you are a powerful warrior. When Kale and Choi Han are having this conversation Ron is keeping an eye on them from a tree. Kale says so I don't see much of a difference between you two. Kale further says when he is my attendant, Ron is simply an attendant. Kale says just like you are Choi Han, the guy who needs to repay me. While questioning is that all? Kale thinks it's almost time, I should hurry. Kale turns and says I'm gonna get going, don't follow me. As Kale moves from the place Ron jumps down the tree and says do you hear that? Ron smirks and says I have raised that boy since he was a baby. Choi Han blocks his way saying Lord Kale doesn't want anyone to follow him. Ron replies I know you rascal. While looking Kale going Ron thinks they say people become more fickle with age I came to check on him, since he left the kittens and only took Choi Han, but I should not have bothered. Kale reaches to the mountain and says come on. Kale gets in the entrance. He pats and clean his dress. As he enters there is huge wind blowing there. Kale says the wind. While looking at the place Kale says wow, this is much more intense than what I imagined. Moving in Kale thinks the wind is strong enough to break down the walls, would I be able to make these sounds if I obtained sound of the wind? Kale smiles and says Taylor would never have gotten his hands on this without Kage's help. While stepping in Kale says now it's a race against the clock. The dragon shouts and says no, you'll get hurt. He climbs while saying you're incredibly weak. Kale keeps moving, he suddenly turns. The dragon says I was just passing by. While looking at it Kale turns and thinks so he followed me here, but I have no time to waste on that dragon. Kale further says the intensity of the wind here changes every 3 hours. This us when it's at its weakest. I need to finish everything before the intensity changes. The dragon says you are a weak human. The wind is too strong. Kale enters that area and the dragon questions so, how are you so strong? While entering that area Kale thinks the wind is picking up as I step closer to the center. But I'm just getting pushed back a little. This isn't enough to break my shield. He further thinks I actually expected to be pushed back a few times. I'm planning on reducing the size of the shield to lessen the resistance. He says I'll fine. Kale tries to get in. The power says I am full of regret. Kale gets a jolt. The power again says I am full of regret. Kale looks at it and thinks I knew I would hear a voice, just as the tree talked to me. The power again says I have so many regrets. Kale looks at it and thinks there is something weird about each of ancient powers, why did Taylor think this power was serious? The power says the man who possesses a familiar power. I do not wish for you have this power. Kale stops and thinks a familiar power. The power starts speaking very loudly, for I have betrayed my comrades. I was an imbecile. I survived by myself and grew old. How disgraceful is that? I wanted everyone to live. Kale is holding himself very difficulty, and the power further says, but my wish will never come true. How tragic indeed. That's why I couldn't finish the tower. Kale replies, you are so loud. While he thinks in mind that he is not serious at all, just super whiny. Kale rumbles and thinks this is annoying. The food critic was better. The power says regeneration is useless. All it does is protect yourself, nothing else. I'm worthless trash. Kale, while trying to get close to it, thinks who cares? Survival comes first. I need powers that can protect me. Kale says I just have to take 5 more steps. He starts talking steps and says 1. He thinks that the shield might break. And I might cut by the wind, I should shrink it. The power says even when the wind sliced through my body like a sharp blade, I didn't die. Kale keeps moving while counting 2 and thinks ancient powers sure are talkative. The power says this is a cursed power. Kale takes another step and says 3. The power says my heart kept beating, but I couldn't do the same, for I was afraid of death. I was hurt all the time, so I was afraid of pain. Kale takes another step and says 4. The power keeps speaking and says, and even more afraid of the death that awaited me. And Kale takes another step saying, and finally, the 5th step. And the wind stops. The power says I chose to throw away my beliefs in order to live. Kale says whatever, survival always comes first. He comes near to the stone tower and says it's so plain that there's no point in making it better. Kale puts his hand forward and says it's too easy, here's the last stone. There comes a flash. The dragon seems amazed and says what? The power says I tried to fight them, but I didn't know that I was not good with pain. They did not serve the gods. I only realized this after my group got disbanded and I was locked up alone. The bastards of the dark forest, who served the gods, only ever gave me disgusting food. After listening to it, Kale thinks, where have I heard this before? The power further says I built a stone tower in the hopes of turning back time, but then I destroyed it because my selfishness disgusted me. Even though I was caught running away from my comrades, there I was, wishing for my own happiness. Kale flips his coat and says humans are selfish beings. There is silence. Kale says, are you done? The power coughs and says my sister said the same thing. She was the best, very reliable, I miss her. Kale thinks this is driving me nuts. The power says to the man who possesses a familiar power, your insolence reminds me of my brother. I envy how rude and crass you can be. Kale thinks, is he trying to pick a fight with me? The power says now, destroy the tower, then you will overcome your limits. Kale grins and says this is what I've been waiting for. Kale kicks the tower. Dragon thinks that human is strange. There is a glow, and Kale and Dragon are looking at it. There is a glowing ball type thing. Kale looks at it. He reaches near it and grabs it. There is a shine which suddenly enters his body. He puts hand on his chest and thinks, okay, I can feel the energy of my body. He further says this energy will strengthen my shield and regenerate any wounds at a much faster rate than the average human body. After this, Kale and the dragon comes out of that place. Kale glances at him and he turns. Kale says, do you want to tag along? The dragon replies, you are very weak, so you need protection. But I hate humans. Saying this, the dragon flew away in the grasses. Kale says, make up your mind. The dragon is making some movement sounds. Kale says, I can see you standing on the grass. Kale takes deep breath and thinks, I guess I have to take care of him, too. Choi Han comes and says, Lord Kale. Did you tumble down the mountain? Kale thinks, darn it, and replies, yeah, a bit. That night, on the outskirts of Perthal City, Kage is in full anger. Taylor questions, what is it, Kage? She replies, hold on, don't talk to me. She is groaning with anger. Taylor says, what's wrong? Are the gods talking to you again? She hits a chair and says, I hate this. Another man comes and fixes the chair, while Kage steps outside the room. Taylor waves his hand and says, you don't have to follow us. He replies, yes, my lord. Kage opens the door and Taylor says, Kage, what's going on? She replies, hang on. She steps out and says, what the heck, it's true. Taylor leans while looking at a stone tower and says, destroy it, if you want your wish granted, is what it says. Kage presses his head and says, I suggest you do it. Damn it, the god of death wants to destroy it. Taylor looks at her and says, what? She sighs and replies, this is the first time he hasn't sprouted nonsense. I usually hear his voice once a year at best. Taylor questions what's so special about the stack. She replies, it will be the turning point of your lives, is what the god said. She says, and that the choice is all yours. But he also said, don't destroy it if you want to live an easy life. She looks at the letter and says, you probably can't see it, but there's an envelope, understand that rock. I think this stack was built just for that. She turns and says, I don't sense any danger, so what will you do? Taylor smiles and says, let's destroy it. She kicks the tower and breaks. Meanwhile, Taylor thinks of the words, don't destroy it if you want to live an easy life. He further thinks, well, my life has never been easy. Nor do I want it to be, I'm going to fix my legs and march on forward. Taylor looks at it and says, I must overthrow the damned Sten family. Taylor opens that letter which states the Crown Prince possesses an ancient power. It's healing star that is of no use to him. It's a power that can cure an deformity once, and he's looking for a means to keep the second and third princes in check. Taylor trembles and says, this sure will be the turning point. Kage snatches it and says, let me see. She starts reading it, which states your legs might not move, but your brain, arms, eyes and mouth and every other part of you is alive. I leave the decision to Taylor. Sten, the eldest son of the Marquis of Sten. Taylor says, Kage, let's put the butler in charge and go to the capital. She replies, okay, I know you can look out for yourself. He replies, that's right, I used to be like that. Taylor thinks that I shouldn't have let my guard down, I should have taken care of myself. Then maybe I could have avoided this injury. Taylor says, to make it in time for the events at the royal palace, we must hurry. Kage says, okay, let's go. The kittens are looking at them. One says, Own, can we go home now? Other replies, yep. We did everything he asked us to do, so let's go have a late night snack. They says, yay, a late night snack. The next morning, Choi Han tags his bag. Kale stares at him and says, is that all you're taking? Choi replies, yes, my lord. Kale sighs and throws a bag towards him while saying, take this with you. Choi grabs it and says while opening, Lord Kale, this is. Kale glances at him and says, what? Why? What's wrong? Kale further says, throw it away if you don't want it. He turns and says bye while thinking it was a small gesture, but I feel like that was a nice way to say goodbye. Choi grips it with happiness and says, I'll be back, my lord. The knight says, I'm the to train while you're away, so I'll be Lord Kale's guard when we get to the capital. Han says, take care. Ron smiles and says, have a safe trip. Vikros also says, I'll have my knives sharpened. The kittens comes to Choi and Choi sits to say goodbye. The dragon is looking at him and swirls a blue light towards him. Choi, while patting his bag, thinks, I've already received so much, but he keeps giving me more, should do my part to repay him. Choi says, I'll see you in the capital. The day after Choi Han left, they all left Perthel and headed for the capital. Kale steps out of the carriage and Hans says, the sun is setting, my lord. We should set up camp here. Kale replies, okay. The kittens are whispering, looking at them. Kale says, what is it? Kale smirks and questions, what? Did you meet the dragon? Kale takes a deep breath and thinks, now that I've said goodbye to Choi Han, I've got a dragon following around. It's what he wants, so I can't stop him now. There is a sudden sounds of horse and a carriage coming. The knight says, I'll go take a look. The coachman of that carriage says, do you mind if we set up camp next to you? The knight questions, who are you? He replies, I'm Tom, a knight working for the Sten family. After listening this, Kale says, damn it. I didn't pay attention to the carriage because it looked so plain. He further says, I noticed the crest of the Hennitus family, so I decided to ask. Taylor says, I'm Taylor Sten. Kale seems unpleased and thinks after one left, 3 showed up. And not just any 3, one's a dumb dragon, one's a crazy priestess who wants to be excommunicated, and the other's last name is Sten. Kale takes a deep breath and comes to Taylor. Taylor says, I know this is very sudden. We will leave if you're uncomfortable with the idea. Taylor says everyone in my life began to avoid me when I became paralyzed from the waist down. I was literally abandoned. Taylor thinks although the Henitus family is neutral, they might not want anything to do with me. Kale says why would you leave? Kale steps towards Taylor and says I don't own this land and I wouldn't do something that childish to a fellow traveler. Kale raises his hand towards Taylor and says I'm Kale Henitus, son of Count Henitus. Taylor opens the door and says I can't step out of the carriage because of my legs. Kale replies I know. They both shake hands and Taylor says nice to meet you, Lord Kale. This is my priestess Kage. She's been traveling with me. Kage smiles and says pleased to meet you, Lord Kale. I'm Kage, a priestess. May the calm of the night be with you. Kale grins and thinks the calm if the night? Yeah, right. I thought she wanted to be excommunicated because she was sick of being nice to others. Kale says I don't believe in gods. Loud mode on. Kale remembers Hans, Knight and Ron while thinking dirty Kale made everyone worry. He thinks the Knight saying I should have gone with you, my lord. And Hans saying my lord. How could you fall as soon as I leave you side? And Ron saying my goodness, sir. You're breaking my poor old heart. Kale smiles and says I don't believe in gods. Kage seems shocked and thinks who says that kind of stuff out loud? Taylor says you're a funny man. Kale replies yes, a kind of I am. Kale thinks Taylor must have spent a lot of money on installing magic apparatuses in his house in Perthel, since Vinian is out to get him and he gets no support from his family. He raises his hand and calls Hans while thinking I can see why he ran out of money. I'm sure he and Kage are on their way to the capital to meet the crown prince after reading my note. Hans comes and says yes, my lord. Kale says help them, give them food and set up their tent next to ours. Kale further says and don't come looking for me. I'm going to leave everything up to you. Hans replies yes, my lord. I shall serve them as I have served you. Kale steps and says okay, whatever bring me a drink. Hans replies yes, sir. Kale turns to Taylor and says all right, then. I'll be off, Lord Taylor. Taylor replies thank you for your generosity, Lord Kale. Kale bows down and says generosity? It was nothing. Kale thinks I just don't want to get involved with you. Kale turns and orders they seem to have only one knight, so stand guard them, too. The knight replies yes, my lord. The kittens are looking at all this and Hong says I know these people. Own replies I've seen them before, too, Hong. Kale comes to them and says pretend you don't know them. They replies like we did with the dragon. Kale says yes. They questions is the dragon going to keep following us? Kale while remembering it says all I intended was to save his life, but since he keeps following me, I should put him to good use. The kittens shivers. Kale thinks he's an impressive being. Incomparable to even Rosalind, who possesses incredible mana sensitivity. Kale smiles and says he's going to have his work out for him. The next morning Kale wakes up and is yawning. Suddenly he hears some noise. He says what the? Hans comes and says Lord Kale, good morning. Kale questions him what's going on. Why is it so noisy? Hans points towards them and says well, I think Lord Taylor had a misunderstanding, my lord. Kale questions a misunderstanding? Kale steps towards them and says is something the matter? Taylor replies I'm sorry Lord Kale, it seems someone has tracked me down. This is the same sign which was left before many times by the dragon. Kage shouts we made sure to keep our trip a secret. Whoever did this must possess a power that even I can't detect. This is too much. Kale keeps quiet and thinks of course she doesn't have the power to detect a dragon. I get that they're startled by the boar though. Taylor says Lord Kale, this is meanwhile Kale calls Vic Ross. Vic Ross comes and says yes, my lord. Kale replies I think we should have steak for breakfast. Vic Ross replies once again, the meat looks to be the highest quality. Taylor looks at him and says once again. Kale tells Taylor a member of our group delivers us food. Taylor says who is it? Kale replies although he doesn't look it, he's actually shy, so you won't see him. They blush and says it seems we were mistaken. Kale says it's all right. Vic Ross is an excellent chief. Two should try his steak. Taylor says Lord Kale, I heard you were on your way to the capital. If you don't mind, could we follow you there? Kale thinks that I knew he would say that. Kale smiles and replies, do as you please. Kale thinks that they'll have no way of knowing that I sent that letter, and if I bring them safely to the capital, they'll owe me one. Kale looks at them and thinks, after all, I'll be helpful to have them on my side. Taylor says thank you. We won't travel with you all the way. Just until we reach someplace nearby. Kale thinks that he knows his boundaries. He is saying that because entering the capital together will cause problems. Kale grins and says all right. Let's see how things go. Taylor replies okay, thank you again for letting us travel with you. You can drop us off wherever you want. Kale points at Hans and says noted, Hans. He further says bring their meals to the carriage. Hans replies yes, my lord. Kage comes to Kale and says Lord Kale. Kale replies yes, what's it, priestess? Kage replies you said you don't believe in any god, is that really true? Kale thinks why is she asking me this? Kale replies yes, it's true. Kage says I see and starts walking. Taylor asks her what is it, Kage? She says I just find it strange. Taylor says find what strange? She replies it's just I feel uneasy, as if the god of death is stroking the back of my head out if pity. Kale and his companions enjoyed a safe and uneventful trip as they made their way to the capital. Then on the day before their arrival, Lord Kale is sitting in his room. Taylor says Lord Kale. Kale says what is it? Taylor replies Lord Kale, I noticed that you love to drink. Kale thinks the Lord can't go a day without drinking. He further says that but you seem to be much more than that. The Kale Henitus we saw on the way over here was very different from the rumors. Taylor keeps saying you always stayed in your carriage as to not bother us, and always provided us the best of care, your subordinates followed you closely. And above all else, you treated us like ordinary people. Taylor smiles and says Lord Kale. What do you say we have a drink before we bid farewell? Kale questions what do you want? Taylor thinks he is no lout. He is actually very bright. Kale says what kind of person do you think I am? Kale smiles and throws a bag of money on the table. He says I don't know why you want to go to the capital when the entire kingdom's attention is focused there, but those that approach me all have one purpose to get something from the rich lout of Henitus family. Kale says you are here for my money, aren't you? Taylor says so you knew. Kale says of course. Kale I could tell you don't have enough money, and that you would need lots of it in order to keep a low profile in the capital. Kale smiles and says I'm sure that is not why you first approached me, but I bet you are thinking, since I have got a golden goose next to me, I might as well try to ask for help. That is right. If I ask you for money and you give it to me I'll be gaining something. And even if you turn down my request, I don't think you will tell Vinian about it because you seem to have getting mixed up in complicated situations. You are a smart person who keeps his true self hidden off purpose. Taylor says thank you, Lord Kale. Kale further says that is what I think of you. Kale questions you are leaving at dawn, right? He replies yes, I thought about leaving quietly, but here I am. We must manage on our own from now on. Kale says are you going to enter through the temple? Taylor replies yes, that is the plan. Kale says but Vinian or the Marquis will probably find out in about 3 days. I'm sure there are people looking to play politics at the God of Death Shrine, too. Taylor says you really are well informed. Kage seems amazed and says there must be a reason why you are so interested in as, my lord. Kale taps his finger on the table and says stay one more night, Lord Taylor. Made the reservation with this money. Kale further says then ride in my carriage with Kage and have the others in your group come in a day later. While sliding a bag towards him Kale further says here this is a magic apparatus that makes everything around it invisible for 5 minutes. Taylor says why are you going to such lengths? There is nothing in this for you. Kale replies well, the answer is pretty obvious. He looks at Taylor and thinks I got him into this situation, so I should help out. Also, if Taylor becomes the head of the Sten estate, I won't have to worry about the power-hungry stance anymore. That will mean less trouble for the Henitus estate and an easier life for me. Kale says because I feel bad for you. I want to see why a crippled man with a target on his back is going through all this trouble. He further says that I feel bad that the eldest son of a Marquis is asking the lout of Henitus family for money. Taylor clenches his fist and says the note was right. I can no longer feel my knees, but my eyes, nose, mouth and hands and every other part of my body is still alive. Taylor smiles and says thank you for your pity, I needed that. Kale replies I do have one condition, forget everything that has happened. Kage says Lord Taylor and I won't tell a soul. We will swear to the god of death. I'm sure you know this, but a person who breaks a vow made in the god of death name will die. Kale replies yes I am aware. Please make the vow now. Kage says I take it that you won't be joining us? Kale nods and say no, I have no intention of joining you. If this puts me in trouble, I'm going to spill the beans right away. Kage says to Vinyan. Kale replies yes. Taylor says Kage, let's do it. Kage closes her eyes and meets his both palms and says I, the daughter of eternal night, wish to make a vow with Taylor that under the name of the night we make this vow upon our lives. Anyone who breaks this vow will be doomed to eternal darkness. She gets a jolt and says I, Kage and Taylor, shall keep everything that was discussed here a secret for the rest of our lives. She further says with the exception of Kale Henitus, we will not disclose this matter to anyone else. Taylor says I will not disclose the matter to anyone else. Kale is looking at his hands while Kage says what you are feeling right now is the power of the vows, if we break our vows, it will inform you, our witness, of our imminent demise. Kale replies I see. After this Taylor extends a bottle towards Kale and says all right then Lord Kale, let's have a drink. Kage brings the glass with happiness and Taylor says we should toast to this joyous occasion. While looking at them Kale thinks does she carry around wine glasses? Kale says you really are something, priestess. She replies isn't it a little strange to see a priestess drink? Kale replies it is none of my business. Kage says wow, I really like you. Cage says Lord Kale, don't you want to get to know an older woman with a great personality? Kale replies no I don't. Taylor says this but about an older guy with a great personality? Kale replies no, thanks. Both of them start laughing. There is a sound of clink of the glasses and they say cheers. On a dark moonless night, the three bonded over a bottle of rich liquor. The next day they all are traveling in the carriage to capital. Kale says we'll arrive at the gates of the capital in 2 hours. The kittens glance at Taylor while he is smiling. Taylor says Lord Kale, how much do you know about the event being held by the royal palace? Kale replies I've never been to the palace. I've only been to the Northeastern Noble Children's meets a few years ago. Taylor says I see. This event is a festival to celebrate the 50th birthday of His Majesty the King. It's a joyous festival for the people of the kingdom. Are you not looking forward to it? Kale groans and says the festival? He thinks I'm already nervous at the thought of the terrorist attack. Other than the members of the secret organization, I'm the only one who knows about the attack in advance. He further thinks that this knowledge troubles my mind and is a burden on my shoulders. But I can't turn a blind eye because I know the horrors that death brings. He thinks that I'll try to stop it, but I'll leave if I get hurt or the situation looks difficult. Kale thinks that I just do as much as I can without suffering any losses. After thinking all this Kale replies this isn't really a festival for you either, is it? Taylor grins and says I think if this as the final stretch before the festival. Taylor says Lord Kale. He replies yes. Taylor says watch out for the crown prince. He further says I may have been abundant, but I have my ways of getting information in the Sten estate. Although this festival has always been in place, summoning the noble heirs was the crown prince's idea. Taylor says I don't know how to explain him. Kale replies he has a silver tongue. Taylor says correct. Taylor says yes that is right. So you knew. Kale says well, it is not exactly a secret the first. Taylor says I suppose not but I have never heard anyone say it better than you have. Kale thinks yes, quiet, silver-tongued. The crown prince is very skilled at flattering and praising people so he uses people without them ever realizing it. A great example is Choi Han, the crown prince lauded as his friend and hero. Choi Han thought highly of the crown prince since he regarded a commoner like him as a friend. Kale thinks but only because he had no idea that he was being used. He uses people, but he uses them for the right reasons. He doesn't use people for his own profit or power, he simply uses his words for the kingdom, the people, or for even bigger things. Kale thinks he praises them while giving them heartbreaking reasons for their help, and the nice kids like Choi Han or Rosalind end up helping him. Taylor says anyway, Lord Kale. The Crown Prince is well, just as you described him, so getting involved with him will be tiresome. Kale replies, you don't have to worry. I plan to stay as quiet as possible, I don't like being noticed. There is a complete silence in the carriage. Kale says, why are you looking at me like that? Taylor replies, do you really think that is possible? Never mind. Kage says, yes, never mind. Kale replies, even if I do meet him, what you are worried about won't happen. Kale smirks and says, I'm quite silver-tongued myself. He says the Crown Prince backs off when he meets people like himself. So if he subtly uses people by praising them, I just have to do the same. Kage says, I think this attitude works better for you, Lord Kale. You look like a real bad guy. Kale shrugs and says it is better than looking gullible. While looking outside of the window, Kale says the capital is something else. Taylor starts explaining the city and says the kingdom of Ruwon is the land of rocks. First, if you look at ancient tales, even before this kingdom was founded, the land had many tales related to rocks. He further says one of those tales claims this land is protected by a rock-like guardian. It was a guardian that would protect you from any attack. He fought at the forefront against the evil that attacked the continent. Kage says, Taylor, you must like that story a lot. Taylor replies, yes, I do. The guardian stood steadfast like a rock even when his whole body was destroyed. That's how he protected the rock-covered land and its people in the northeast. Taylor nods his head and says beings like that don't exist in real life. This is why I like this myth. Kage replies, I guess you don't believe it. Only a handful of people would protect something at the risk of their own lives. Kale says that is right. While looking out if window, he thinks he didn't protect himself, but the entire northeast coast of that is something I can't understand. But I have never heard that myth before. Kale further thinks that many myths and legends appear in the birth of a hero, but this didn't come up until the 5th book. Taylor says, yes, I don't think it is a famous story, I only came across it while researching old tomes and power. Kale peeks out of the window and pass magic thing to Taylor saying, take this, get ready. Suddenly someone knocks the door of the carriage and says, Lord Gale, the Capitol Guards wishes to check the carriage. Kale slams the door. And the carriage is empty, and Kale says, here. The guard replies, go ahead. Soldiers search the palanquin. Kale was standing leaning on the pole. Soldiers saw inside the palanquin and there were only 2 bottles and the palanquin was empty. They stand back and blow theirs head and allow Kale to sit in and said, please pass through, my lord. Kale steps on the stairs of palanquin holding a bottle. In charge closed the door of palanquin and said, welcome to the capital. The palanquin started moving. Kale was sitting on the seat and Grey Cat was sitting with him on the seat while Red Cat was on the floor. Kale said with smile, they welcomed us to the capital. Taylor Sten lifted his hand up holding a jewelry item and said, it's been a while since I welcomed anywhere. At west of the capital, the palanquin stopped in front of a big house. Kale said to Taylor, Lord Taylor, once we arrive at the capital, Ron will show you the way. Follow that path, then forget everything. Hans opened the door of the palanquin and said, my lord, we have arrived. Kale got out of the palanquin and Taylor spoke from behind, thank you, let us meet again with smiles on our faces. Palanquin started moving to their destination. Kale stand in front of the door and saw the house surprisingly and said, this is better than I expected, the Henadas truly are rich, it's not super rich fancy or sparkly, but it looks more expensive than the neighboring nobles' houses. Servants opened the door and were standing in row and blow their heads. And say in one voice, Lord Kale Henadas, welcome, we're at your complete disposal. Kale come in the house, Hans was standing behind him and cats were also walking behind him. Kale feels uneasy and looked at Hans like he doesn't like this and thought, they're too courteous, what's with them? Hans also looked at him as he don't know. Kale said to them, raise you heads. Servants raised their heads. Kale said, from now on there's no need to be overly polite, I won't pick fights with those who work hard at their jobs, I heard my mother handpicked all of you, I also heard that you take pride in your jobs, so I expect you to work accordingly. Go to Hans for any work-related questions, and thought, I have a lot to do, so I'll leave them for Hand to deal with. He walked towards the inside and said, let's go. Hans followed him and replied, yes, my lord. servants were standing at their position behind them. In charge put his hand on his head and said worriedly, I don't think Lord Kale would actually come, what a headache. He's still our lord, so we need to bear with it, that's true. Well, at least he's never acted like a loud in front of us, we should look after him so that he doesn't cause any mayhem. Kale out an envelope on the table. Hans was standing behind him and asked, Are you not going to go, my lord? Kale said unhappily, Do I have a choice? He replied, No, my lord. It's the gathering of the Northeast. Kale said, You're right. Hans said again, Here, this is the list of the noble Harris gathered in the capital, and give him a paper. Kale take the paper and said, Okay, did Ron say he finished his job? He replied, Yes sir. Kale said, You did a good job, go and take rest. Hans bowed and said, Yes my lord, I will. Kale said just send up something for me to eat. He replied, Yes lord. Kitten walked in the room where Kale was sitting. Kale stand up from the coach and opened the door of the terrace and stand there, and put his hands in pockets. Air was blowing and leaves were floating. Kale was sitting on the couch and in front of him Black Dragon was sitting on the chair and between them a table was set with food. Grey Kitten was sitting on the table while Red was trying to climb up. Kale said to Dragon, Have some, you must be starving. Black Dragon was staring the food with his blue cute eyes. Grey Cat put a piece of meat in his mouth. Kale thought whole drinking the wine, eat up, you'll have a lot to do, it would be nice, to have a house this big, to relax and enjoy delicious food, and out the glass on table. He thought, I'd love to have a life with all three and said this is very nice. Someone knocked the door. Dragon and Kitten looked at the door. Kale stand up nervously and the glass dropped down and shattered on the ground. Kale asked loudly, Choi Han, is that you? And thought, of course not, it should take 3 more days to arrive, it's impossible to reach the capital in 3 days, unless he's not human. Choi Han would not march into the capital with the injured Lark, although I gave Choi Han potion with divine powers, it won't work on the wolf tribe, who were abundant by the gods and Rosalind's too cautious to have used high magic like teleportation. I also clearly told him to stay at a specific inn when he arrives. Kale opened the door and said shockingly, You. It was Choi Han carrying someone on his back and said, Lord Kale, I'm sorry, you were the only person I could go to. Kale said, Bring him in and thought, Lark of the Blue Wolf tribe, he's in bad shape, that fever signals the wolf tribe's first berserk mode, this shouldn't happen until a year later, why is it happening now? Hans and Rosalind was standing behind the Choi Han laid down the Lark on the bed. Kale was standing behind him and said to Hans, Bring something to drink. He replied, Yes sir and went out. Kale looked this and thought, looking at his state, I don't think we can stop him from being going but berserk. Rosalind was also standing near the bed. Lark has grey hairs and blue eyes, he looked tired, and was sweating. Kale said him, Stop resisting and just close your eyes, everything will be okay. He had dream when his uncle dropped him in a forest and went out and he was continuously calling him worriedly and scarily. Choi Han said to Kale, Lord Kale, why is Lark like this? The portions you gave me did not work either. Rosalind's told me that potions don't work on the wolf tribes but none of the healing spells worked either. He said angrily, I need to protect him, I should be protect him. Kyle replied, Calm down, at this rate, you will be the one going berserk, if you trust me, leave this to me. Choi Han said, I trust you. Kale replied, Okay and looked at him and thought worriedly, so did something happen? I knew Choi Han was kind and all, but at this point in the book, he only just starts to open up, he doesn't open up to Lark this much just yet. Is this also a result of my changes to the story? The next in line of the throne of Kingdom Breck, Rosalind, she's the genius who's planning to throw that position away. Her bright crimson hair is like that of roses but her character is more like that of sun. Rosalind feels something and said, Such strong mana and looked at the dragon and went near to him. Dragon waved her hello. Kale saw them and thought, I heard dragons take unnatural liking to witches, he must be interested in her, which is why he's giving her mana, stay put. Dragons wave her and then fly, she asked shockingly, What is this? Kale point on the Lark and said, That comes first. She looked at them and said, What's happening to Lark? Kale glances at her and thought, I thought she did be too cautious, she has to use high magic. They were probably able to arrive at the capital in 3 days because Rosalind used teleportation magic, she revealed her magic skills, against all my expectations. Kale asked her, You are a witch correct? She replied, yes I am. Kale asked again, have you heard about the wolf tribe's berserk mode? She replied, I've heard about it in book but I've never heard about fevers and pains. He said, it's because this is his first time. She asked confusingly, what? He said, when beast men first go to berserk, they lose their consciousness due to the pain from a sudden physical change. After their first time, they can use the but-seek mode as their weapon. He will be going into berserk mode very soon. She said, I don't know how you are, but I can tell what's going on, he's just a kid. He replied, I know. Door knocked and hand come in. Kale called him, Han. He replied, yes sir. Kale said, bring me a stretcher, put him on the stretcher, and take him to the training grounds under the mansion. Also, be sure to empty the training grounds, hurry. He said confusingly, sir, you are bringing a sick person to the grounds. Choi Han stand from the ground, Kale said, Choi Han and you, and looked at her. She replied, I'm Rosalind. He said, yes Rosalind, you too, are you going to get roughed up? They both said shockingly, what? He said, wolf tribes, like bear and lime tribes are beast men who have predators' blood running through them. These beast men have their parents or siblings take care of them when they first go berserk. They take away attacks from the kid in berserk mode and protect them from harming themselves. Obviously, that won't be possible with him, let's pretend you two are his parents. He clapped and said again, you can be siblings if you prefer, but protect him however you can. They were in the training ground and Lark was lying down on the ground. Choi Han asked to Kale, Lord Kale, how long will his birth mode last? He replied, he is the purest even among the pure bloods. Choi Han said again, meaning it's going to last a long time. He replied, yes, a couple of hours maybe. Choi Han said, I'll see it done, I'm Lark's brother. Kale said them, both of you to the center. They go near the Lark and stand near to him. His berserk was starting, he screamed with pain, long nail grows in his hands, his eyes turned red, long sharp teeth appeared. Lark was trembling, Choi Han and Rosalind watching him worriedly. Lark was converting into the wolf. Dragon made a protective shield around them. Kale was standing holding Red Cat and Grey Cat, one also standing there. Dragon was flying near to them. Kale said to Dragon, a mana shield, Dragon, you're quite amazing. He replied, and you're weak, so I must protect you. Kale said rudely, suit yourself. He heard the voice of Lark screaming and asked to Dragon, while you're at all, could you block out the sound? Dragon waved his hand and stopped the voice. Kale said, I don't know why you don't use that power. He replied, none of your business. Kale looked at him and thought, if magic is improving so fast, I can really put them to good use. Kale sit down on the ground and cross his legs. Dragon and cats were also sitting near to him. He looked bored. He looked at the cats and said, you two have not been through berserk mode yet, right? They shook their head in the negative. He asked again, but do you know about anything about it? They said in their voice, not really, there was no one to teach us. He looked at them and thought, I knew it, I think they are pure blood too, that means their first time will also be rough. The wolf, tiger, bear and whale tribes, blues are their reason during berserk mode, that's why these 4 tribes are said to be beast men who are closest to monster. He said to them, I don't know much about the cat right, but if you feel you are going berserk, have a fever, or start hurting, come to me quickly, and thought, I said I'd take care of them, so I better do it right. Cat starting hugging him, he said, what are you doing? Lark was shouting, his tail was appeared. Kale looked him and thought, why did this wolf boy go berserk? In the novel Birth of a Hero, later goes through his first berserk mode a year later, not now. The berserk was triggered by the death of one person, that person is Hitler Pendrick. Pendrick reminded Lark of his dead uncle. Lark went crazy after death of his uncle, the tribe leader, so he tried to kill everything in his sight. Lark was totally converted into the wolf and breathing angrily. Choi Han and Rosalind called his name. Rosalind said, Lark, snap out of it. Lark looked them angrily and opened his mouth, his sharp teeth showed and he attacked on Choi Han. Choi Han put a wood stick in his mouth and trying to stop him. Rosalind shouted, Lark, snap out of it, it's Choi Han. Lark attacked him with his long nails but Choi Han hurried back and missed his attack. Kale said, you expect him to just regain his senses? You might as well knock out cold. And say to cats, own, hong, watch the wolf kid's movement closely, that's how the beast men move on their instincts, unlike humans, they can trust and move on their instincts alone, that's the beauty and the greatness of beast men. Going berserk is neither fearful nor scary, it's when they are at their strongest. I mean, he might be from a different tribe but watch him move on instinct, and learn from his beastly move, then make it yours. He was telling him while looking at fights and movements of the lark. He rubbed own, gray cat head and said, or find a way to bite the throats or predators like bears, tigers, or wolves. Lark attacked Choi Han again but Rosalind stopped his attack by her magic and stand in front of the Choi lark. She called his name and said, "Lark, you remember me, don't you? I said that we're family now, so snap out of it." Choi Han ran on the other side and said, "Lark attack me, I'm the one who will protect you." Lark moved his head and saw him angrily. Kale said to Dragon, "You watch now Rosalind, you'll seize magic to make sure no one gets hurt and see how Choi Han is using his aura to protect the wolf kid, rather than to attack him, it's harder to not hurt people than to hurt them." Lark attacked Choi Han again. Kale said to Dragon, "But you'll learn quickly since you're a dragon." He replied, "I am a dragon, I can do anything." Kale said with smile, "I know, so watch and decide for yourself." He thought, it really might take 2 hours until he tires out, should have brought some wine. Dragon and cats were sitting near to him silently. In the ground, Lark comes into his human form and taking deep breaths. Choi Han and Rosalind standing in front of him. Lark said, "Rosalind, I'm sorry." He fell down. Choi Han ran towards him and kept his head in his lap. He saw the Kale and said, "Uncle." Kale sit down and put his hand on his shoulder and said, "You can rest now, it all over." Lark closed his eyes. Choi Han put him on the scratcher. Rosalind was standing near to them. Kale throw a bottle with red liquid towards her. She caught it and said, "Positions don't work on Lark." Kale said, "Why would I give potions to a member of the worst tribe? It's for you, good work today." She looked him confusingly and held the bottle tightly. She said thanks to him. He replied, "Don't mention it." He came near the Choi Han and said, "Choi Han, we need to talk." Choi Han looked at him. "Servants take care of Lark." In the room, Kale and Choi Han was sitting in front of each other, and food was served on table. Kale said to Choi Han, "Now tell me." He replied, "Yes sir, it was a smooth ride up to the point I met up with Rosalind. I went to the city that you told me about and found a caravan headed to the capital, just as you said. It was more a small group of merchants than an actual caravan, since it had about 5 people when I found them. They were actually looking for 2 mercenaries to be bodyguards. The man they had originally hired was injured, that's also where I found Rosalind, as she matched the description you gave me." Kale thought, the kingdom of Brek is located right beyond the northwestern borders of Rowoon. Rosalind was passing through Rowoon to get to the magic tower in Whipper Kingdom, when she was attacked by assassins. She got away using her magic but she could not figure out who was behind the attack, so she must have gone to Rowoon's capital to gather more information. Choi Han said, "She was headed to the capital as well, so I thought it was a great chance to get to know her." Call Chicken feelingly, "Get to know her?" He replied, "Yes sir, I am not the friendly type but I figured it cannot hurt to be friendly with one's comrades." Kale said, "You did not have to try that hard," and thought, they were not supposed to become close until they meet Lark. According to the novel, Rosalind was on edge and did not become friendly with anyone. Choi Han didn't make friends on his own after the Harris incident. Choi Han said, "Although it was against my nature, I wanted to repay you properly." Kelly's thought, "I knew you did say something like that." Choi Han said, "The caravan was going to pass through the place where you said I would meet Lark, so they decided to stay at a nearby village for a bit. Then there was an incident when we arrived at the village. When we were close to the village, I learned that the bodyguard was a beast man." He remembered the incident when they arrived in the village. The assassin were carrying the box and he asked them, "Are you trading with these villagers?" A man replied, "Not with this village, we are going to trade here with the people from a village down by the mountain." Choi Han replied, "I see," and thought, would I be able to meet Lark if I follow the people from that village? That evening, the merchants were waiting for the people of the village but they didn't come. Their leader said, "Something's off, it's already past the whole of appointment. I am sorry but could you take these to the village down by the mountain? They are not the type of forget an appointment, so I am a bit concerned." Choi Han remembered what Kale said him that take the bodyguards with him and go to that village. Leader said to the man, will you be alright? He replied, I will do it. Choi Han and Rosalind went with him. When they reached at the village, the wild village was destroyed, peoples were dead and houses were burning now. Choi Han clenched his fists angrily and said, Lord Kale, I saw something familiar there, 5 red stars around a white star. Kale said shockingly, what? You mean a regular member of the secret organization went there? And thought, in the novel, they do arrive at the devastated wolf tribe's village, but the assassins were supposed to go down there, not the regular members. Kale asked, were that all dead? He replied, no, they were trying to kidnap the surviving kids. The village leader was dying while trying to protect his village. They tried to kidnap a total of 10 children while the leader was down. Kale thought worriedly, kidnap? Don't they kill all of them in the novel? Why did they need to kidnap young werewolves? Choi Han was telling him the incident detail, then a boy stepped in between the children and the kidnappers. It was Lark. Kale was looking him confusingly and thought, did he think that killing and kidnapping were different? Originally, Lark stayed hidden even while all the children were being massacred. Wolves cannot bear to stand and watch the death of friends and family weaker than them, so what caused Lark to reveal his nature? This changes the story too much. He was thinking worriedly. Choi Han said, I stopped them, no. He raised his head and looked at Kale and said again, I tried to kill them. Kale said, go on. He said again, I realized from the black power they used, that the man in the black robes without any stars were the same man who attacked the village of Harris. He clenched his fists angrily. Kale asked, they had the same powers as those who attacked Harris? He replied, yes. Kale said, Darren, and thought, I need to act like it's the first time I am hearing this. Choi Han said again, there was a single man among them with 5 red stars on his chest. He's the one who killed the bodyguard. He was a piece of trash who drank the blood of the wolf tribe. And remembered that man who drank blood, he was wearing a black dress with a hood. Kale thought worriedly, the blood-sucking mad wizard. The terrorist attack in the capital's plaza was led by a certain man. He is a piece of trash who drinks the blood of the wolves, the blood-crazy leader of the secret organization. That made visit first appeared in the Blue Wolf Table Village, not in the capital. He's one of the highest-class wizards and extremely bloodthirsty, so why would he try to kidnap the wolfmen cubs? Did rescuing the dragon change plot somewhere? That's the only variable that comes to my mind right now. Choi Han said again, in the end, I couldn't capture or kill them. Anyone I catch committed suicide and the rest were teleported away by the man with the 5 stars. Then the wizard said this, too bad, they were perfect for seeds. I am sure the younger ones taste better too. Kale thought confusingly, seeds? What does that mean? Kale asked, what about the kids? He replied, they were teleported to a nearby and throw Rosalind magic. The merchants from the caravan are also there. Kale thought, so the adult wolf men are all dead and the 10 kids plus the merchants are here. Why did not he just leave the kids to the merchant? So I guess this is how the story goes. He thought angrily, I'll end up with an animal farm at this rate. Kale asked Choi Han, aren't you curious? He replied, I am curious. Kale thought, I don't need to ask what he's curious about. I'm sure he wants to know everything, who those people are. Why are they doing such things and why I, Kale, know them? He broke the bread and said, I'm going to tell you 2 things, and stand from his seat. Choi Han asked, not everything? Kale replied, that's right, get up. Choi Han asked him, where are we going? Kale turned and looked at the wall watch and replied, to the temple of the god of death. Choi Han and Kale comes on the temple on the palanquin, and they standing in front of the temple. Kale said, I'm going to reveal 2 truths here. Choi Han looked at him confusingly. He said, and I'll do that with my life on the line. He walked towards the door and said, Choi Han, follow me, I'm waging my life to tell you these truths. Choi Han follow him. They stopped at the door where 2 men were standing and said, may the dead be with you. Kale said, priest, is there any empty room of death? They looked them confusingly and them looked at Choi Han and thought, the face of a man who went 2 days without food and suffered emotionally, a kind face that makes him look gullible, clothes that show he is not from the city. They said, whose death will you be waging? Kale replied, mine, I'm laying down my own life. Choi Han stepped near to him and said shockingly, Lord Kale. Kale looked at him and said, what is it? He replied, I'll believe you even if you don't do this. Kale looked at him and said, I bet you won't, and thought, he won't be able to believe me because I don't plan to telling him anything about the secret organization. He turned his face and thought, why would I tell him everything? I don't want to be involved. Choi Han's the men who will fight mermaids while riding on the back of strongest beast man, a whale man. Aside from the violent whale tribes, he will get himself into the trouble with all kinds of people. I don't want to be dragged into all of that. Choi Han looked him confusingly. Kale asked, so, priest, is there a room? They replied, yes there is, let's go down to the basement, we will soon prepare the room. They steps down in the stairs to the basement. Priest opened the door and said them, please wait here, while prepare from the inside, and closed the door. Choi Han and clan was standing in front of the door. Kame said, if you really feel like you can believe me, maybe I should tell something first. Choi Han looked at him and said, go ahead sir, I trust you. Kale said, is that so? Then, I'll begin with the first truth, and raise his finger. He said, I know neither the identity nor the purpose of the secret organization. Choi Han said shockingly, what do you mean? Priest opened the door and said, please come in, the person who laid down his life can raise his hand and show it to the priest inside. A priest who opened the door told them and point towards the priest inside. Kale said Choi Han with smile, it's hard to believe isn't it? I can understand that. He looked at him and said, let's go in. Choi Han didn't understand that what he trying to proves and follow him. Choi Han mad Kale was sitting on the chairs, in front of them priest was standing and between them a table was set. Kale raised his hand, priest looked at him and point the papers in front of them. Choi Han picked up the paper and read it, Kale was also picked the paper and started reading it. The touch of death will fall on the person who outs his life on the line and also on those who accompanying him, that's when you can your vow. If the vow is broken, the person whose life was wagered will lose his life, it was written on the paper. Kale read the paper and thought with smile, what a scary note. Priest tap in the table and black smoke was appearing. Choi Han asked confusingly, is this the power of God? Kale replied, yes and thought, so I'll die if I break the vow. Smoke was floating around his hand in circle. Kale said, the priest in front of us is truly deaf and if he's not, the priest will pay for the lie with his life, furthermore I, Kale Henitus, swear to tell Choi Han only the truth in front of the God of eternal rest, and if I lie, I will pay for it by dropping dead on this very spot. Choi Han looked him confusingly and worriedly. Kale thought, I did complete whether I should tell Choi Han everything. I am a regular Korean who just got stuck into a book I was reading, that's how I know what happened up until the 5th book I got stuck into a book I was reading and when I woke up I was the son of a rich nobleman. Although the world will soon be engulfed in war, I wanted to live an easy life here, which is why I meddled with the plot, however I put it, my life will now drift further away from the easy life that I dream of. I will either die in the midst of a continental war or be loathed to death by Chauhan, so I. He said, first, I Kale Henitus, to really know nothing about the identity of the secret organization, it's true, I know what they did because I have read The Birth of a Hero until book 5, but I know nothing about who they are or why they are doing this. Second, this is also very true and sincere, I despise them and wished they could be eradicated. Choi Han asked him, how could you hate them when you don't know them? He replied, because I knew about a few things they were planning to do, the Black Dragon was one and Locke was another. I have lived as a law that life was my dream, I have no intention of becoming the heir of thee and need to use name, Bazan Henitus, my brother by blood, I wish that he become the higher. So why did I come here as the representative? Even though I could have said no when my father asked me to come to the capital? Choi Han said, I don't know. Kale said, because I know what the secret organization is about to do in the capital, I cannot tell you how I know this but I know they are going to kill countless innocent people in the capital, that's why I could not send Basin and I went to stop the attack from happening. Kale thought, obviously, not to the point that I did have to risk my life, and said, I plan to take care of these matters as quietly as I can and return to my state. Choi Han was looking him confusingly. Trajan asked, and you cannot tell me how you know all this? He replied, no I cannot tell that to anyone in this world but I can tell you one more thing, one last truth, I have no intention of harming you. Choi Han clenched his fists and said, I believe you. Kale replied with smile, good to know. Choi Han takes deep breath and said, Lord Kale, please make one more vow, then I'll trust you completely. Kale thought, I didn't see this coming. I mean, all I've been doing was tweaking the truth, which isn't too difficult, but what does he need to trust me completely? I can't say no now, and said, alright, sure. Choi Han said angrily, Lord Kale, I must take my revenge on them. I've never hated someone or some group as much as I hate them. If you find out who they are, please tell me immediately. Kale said, yeah sure, and thought, here I thought it'd be really difficult favor, there's no way I'm going to find out who they are before Choi Han, and said, I Kale Henitus, will tell Choi Han when I find out about the secret organization's identity, otherwise I will pay for it with my life. Is that all? Choi Han replied, yes sir. Kale asked, so we're done? He replied, yes we're done. Kale put his hand on table and vowed. Priest said, I pray you live on. He replied, thank you priest. They came out of the temple. Kale stepped on the stairs of the palanquin and thought, he's saying that I should keep my vows and live a long life, right? What a chilling goodbye. What a chilling goodbye. He came in the palanquin and sit. Choi In was sitting in front of him. Kale said, about the blood-crazed wizard, he's the one behind the incident in the capital. Choi Han asked him, so may I kill him in sight? Kale replied, do you even need to ask? Do whatever you want. He replied, yes sir, I'll kill him for sure. Palanquin started moving. Kale was sitting in the room and door knocked. He gave permission and Ron opened the door and come in holding a cup of tea and said, my lord. Kame saw him and replied, Ron. Ron out the cup of tea in table in front of the Kale. Kale asked confusingly, lemon tea right before bed? Ron replied with smile, that's right. Kale thought as he sipped his tea, I haven't quite reached the tea before bed level yet. Ron asked him while he drinking tea, my lord, may I ask you for a favor? Kale put the cup on table and asked, what? A favor? And thought, this creepy old man is asking for a favor? From me? A man who he cares very little for? Kale looked at him and said, okay, go ahead. Ron said with smile, may I take a vacation for 2 days? Kale looked at him and hold his hand and said with smile, yeah, what a great idea, you have spent many years caring for this lout, you can take as many days off as you need. You really deserve it, Ron, and thought, you can rest as much as you want but 2 days is perfect since I need you back before the terrorist attack to link you with Choi Han, it's so great that I don't have to see this assassin's face for 2 whole days. Ron looked his hand in Kale's hand confusingly. Kale said him to wait here and went near a table and open a drawer. Ron was confused about his behavior. Kale give him some and said, take this, it's not much but could have some great food and spend a good break. Ron take money and looked at the money bag and thought, great food and a good break, I have silently spent many long years beside this lout, beside this puppy-like master. No, it's the time to break that silence and make a move. If those bastards make their way to the western continent, it will be much worse than all pandemonium breaking loose, then I will have to leave even my son here, and asked with smile, my lord, may I really do so? Kale replied with polite smile, of course Ron, you deserve it. Ron thought, deserve it, I am going to either leave alone or with Marab in a few days without saying anything, but I wanted to know what the little pup would say if I asked to go on a vacation for a couple of days, since he must have heard what kind of a man I am from Choi Han. Kale asked with smile, is that enough for you? This is your first vacation in a long time, do you need more? He replied with a smile, this is too much money, my lord. What if I run away with all this money? Or do you want me to run away? Kyle said, you think I don't know you? If you were going to run, you had have gone without a word or told me that you are quitting, is that right? And thought, that's really how Round left in the birth of a hero, he left the Count estate without a word and told Choi Han few conditions when he had to leave for a few days. Ron said, that's correct, you are absolutely right, and thought, Lord Kale has watched me for a long time, just as I had watched him by his side these many years. He might even know me better than my own son does, I must be getting old, and say to him, I will attend to you when you enter the royal palace. Kal replied, sure. Ron thought, I cannot send him in poorer shape than the Duther nobles and royals in the palace, and say it, then I will be leaving now, and bow in front of him. Kale waved his hand in by and said, yeah. Ron looked at him and thought, I can't have this pup master that I raised bed belittled by other people. Next morning, Kale was sleeping on his bed and someone knocked the door, he wake up and said, come in. Hans come holding a cup of tea and said with smile, "Good morning, my lord. Ron said he could not leave you in anyone else's hands. I guess I am just that good." Call replied, "Just stay quiet." Hans again said, "Ron also left me with this task." And served him tea. Kale looked at the tea and asked, "Hans, why is it a lemonade?" He replied, "You lie lemonade, my lord. Ron said to make sure to give this to you." Kale drink it mad thought, what is Ron Palm with this lemonade? Choi Han's stepdad in the room and remembered his meeting with Ron, when he asked Ron, "You are going somewhere?" He replied, "That's right." Choi Han asked again, "Where are you going?" He replied, "That's none of your business." Choi Han looked at him confusingly in him and asked again, "Did you come find me because of Lord Kale?" Ron replied, "Think whatever you want," and walked out. Kale saw the Choi Han and asked, "Choi Han, is Lark awake?" He stepped near to him and said, "Yes sir." Kale said, "I see, take a seat." Kale thought, the wolf tribe sure do recover fast. The bastard of Flynn, our piggy bank, Billos, will arrive at the capital soon. I promised to drink with him when I returned the items that I borrowed from him. I have already set the place to meet him. That's where Choi Han and by laws will properly meet each other. Choi Han sit in front of him. Kale asked, "What about the kids and the merchants in the inn?" Choi Han replied, "I'm planning to check on them on your way back from your meeting." Kale said confusingly, "Meeting?" Hans whispered, "Sir, here's the invitation from the young nobles of the Northeast." Kale thought, I forget about them. I had totally forgotten about them since they are unimportant. How big of a lout should I be when I am there? Hans said, "Lord Kill, there is also a guest here who wishes to see you." He asked, "Is it Miss Rosalind?" Hans replied, "Yes sir." Rosalind was sitting on the ground near the bed of the Lark and looking him worriedly. Rosalind looked worried. Kale thought Rosalind is a quick-witted person, even though she's probably never seen a dragon. I'm sure she knows that the energy she felt yesterday was a dragon. After all, only a dragon can possess such mana. Han said, "She said she did come visit you whenever you are free. Can I see it? Then prepare this place while I have breakfast in my room, but ask Miss Rosalind if you'd like to join me for breakfast." Han said, "Yes my lord." He said with smile, "My lord, it's already past noon, so it's actually lunch." Kale called his name seriously, "Hans." He replied, "Yes sir, I shall go prepare it right now." And walking outside, Call spoke from behind, "And leave the terrace door open on your way out." He replied, "Yes sir." He opened the door. Air was flowing and leaves were floating. Dragon was sitting in the branch of the tree, above the terrace. The black dragon should be able to come in whenever it wants to. Choi Han was sitting in front of Kale and Kale was looking in the window and thought, it's weird how he always has to sleep outside and on a tree branch by the window. Choi Han said, "I will visit Clark while you eat." He replied, "I guess you two are taking turns caring for him." Servants were serving food on the dining table. Choi Han said, "On and Hong are also helping." Kale asked, "What help?" Hong said in his voice, "You know, I think we are too weak to kill Love Wolf tribe member. We might lose even if we go berserk. We need to figure out a way to totally crush them." Oh Hun replied, "Yes, we really need to." And then they both said in one voice, "We are going to study." Kale said, "Yeah, these two aren't there to take care of Lark, they're there to prepare in case they meet such enemy." Choi Han said, "But Lark seemed to be at ease with these two cute rascals nearby." Kale replied, "That's good then." Choi Han, "I did not tell Lark and Rosalind that I brought them here under your orders. I will keep all secrets safe." He replied, "Good." Kale held the cup of tea and thought, I am sure Choi Han behaving like this because of our woe in front of the god of death, but he will never know how tricky words can be and how there can be an understanding gap between the speaker and the listener. The god of death will only follow the words and interpretation of the speaker, Kale. I can take advantage of this loophole, since I made the vow, and drank tea. Kale out the cup and table and said, "Did you say you will kill the blood-drinking wizard when you see him?" He replied, "Yes sir." Kale looked at him and thought, he is not hesitating one bit, and said, "We'll tell you how to find him, after you prevent the terrorist attack, of course." Choi Han looked him confusingly and shockedly. Servant knocked the door and said, "Lord Kale, Lady Rosalind is here." They both stand up from their seats and stand near the door. servant open the door and Rosalind comes in. Servant said, Lord Kale, my lady, please call me if you need anything. Choi Han looked at her and said Rosalind, I'll be with Lark, and went outside. She replied, all right. Now in the room only Kale and Rosalind left. Rosalind said, thank you for inviting me, Lord Kale. He replied, it my pleasure, Lady Rosalind, please take a seat, we have much to discuss. She said, I guess you don't like to beat around the bush. Kale turned his head and said come in. Leaves comes in floating in the air. Rosalind looked at there and said, dragon, is that dragon? They heard the voice of someone sitting on the table. They looked at the table. Kale said, you can introduce yourself. Dragon showed himself and smiling. Rosalind looked at him shockingly. Dragon said, I'm hungry. Kale replied, yeah, eat up. He looked at her and said, we should eat too. She replied confusingly, yes. They sit in the table and start eating. Rosalind thought, this young dragon is eating here, before my eyes at the same table, eating the same steak, no one in the magic tower would believe me even if I told them. She said with a smile, as of which, I cannot believe my eyes, a dragon and a human living together? Dragon looked at the Gale and said to him, this human is very weak, his power is a garbage, that's why I am here. Kale replied while eating, that's right. Rosalind said, I am eating with Lord Kale and a dragon, what a honor. Kale looked at her and thought, she sure is fearless, other sorcerer would have been shaking from head to the while glorifying the dragon. Then, they would have begged him to teach them about mana and magic. Dragon magic, all these sorcerer in the continent are crazy about how it works. Kale said with smile, you can stay for as long as you want. She looked at him confusingly and said, Lord Kale, I have 3 questions, one of them has been answered, though I am left with 2 questions, may I ask you these questions? She looked the dragon. He replied with smile, go ahead. She said, first, are you allowed to let uninvited guests stay at your place? Even if you the guest is a sorcerer, you must be worried about danger since you are a noble. He replied, well, anyone brought by Choi Han are fine and I have this guy, so it's safe. He looked at the dragon who was eating. She said, I see, then my last question. She looked at him and asked, why do you speak to me as though you are below me when you are a noble? He put his hand on plate and said, a witch with crimson hair and crimson eyes and the name which you have told us, Rosalind. Should not I, of course, speak to you with full respect, Princess Rosalind? She looked at him and replied with smile, the caravan master told me you were a lout but I guess he was wrong. He smiled and said, it is true that I'm known for being a lout but sorcerers should judge with their 5 senses and not with rumors on the streets. She replied, you are right, Lord Kyle. We only trust what we observe with our own eyes. Kale thought, Rosalind is a very shrewd person, she will talk down to me when she identifies as a princess but speaks respectfully when she identifies as one of the sorcerer and she is very proud to be a witch, and said with smile, then princess. She said, just Rosalind. Kale folded his hand and asked all right, Lady Rosalind, do you have any other questions? She replied, no, I don't. While Dragon was eating continuously and silently, Kale asked, but are not you against the thought of being tangled up with me? She looked at him and thought, I don't find him rude or dislikable when he told me to stay even after finding out that I was a princess. If I wanted special treatment, I did have told him my full name and identity from the beginning. He also saved Lark by telling us about his condition. Kale said with smile, well, I only asked because it didn't seem like you wanted to go, princess. And eat steak with fork. She looked him and thought, lies, those are just excuses that sounds pleasant to the ear, a human traveling with the dragon, he may be known as a lout, but in fact, he's not. If he wanted to, he would have come forward about the princess and Breck appearing in these lands. She take a sip of wine and said, "It seems you haven't contacted the Rowan royals." "Thank you," Kale replied, "of course. After all, I should hear to the will of the person involved in this matters," and thought, the crown prince would have barged in here as he heard the news. She said, "You're right, Lord Kale. I don't want that all. If the royal palace ever mentioned this matter, please convey that I did not wish to tell them. I will send them a letter." He replied, "Okay," she said with a noble smile. "I am grateful enough that you have provided us a place to stay. I will handle my own matters so that it won't bother you." He replied, "Thank you." She said, "No problem, it's what's right." Dragon and Rosalind both put their hands on a dish. Dragon pulled dish and said, "Eat yours, this is mine." She looked him shockingly. Kale gave him fork and looked at her. He raised his forefinger and whispered, "He's 4-year-old." She looked him confusingly. She turned her head to Dragon and said with smile, "Yes, Lord Dragon, of course." Dragon turned to his dish. Kale said, "Let us continue eating." She replied, "Okay." In front of the Kale house, palanquin was standing. Kale and Choi Han were sitting inside the palanquin in front of each other. Kale said worriedly, "What a troublesome matter." Choi Han said, "What is it? If you are having a trouble, please tell me. I'd love to be of some help." Kale replied, "No, don't worry about this." Choi Han looked him confusingly. Palanquin started moving. Kale, though, the young nobles of the northeast would have seen what a lout Kale has been before, and they would have had reports of my actions from their estates. So I need to be more careful around them. No, I have to be even bolder in front of them. What do I have to do be more lout? Should I act like a dog? Nothing would be worse than a lout who's also a dog. At the Count Wilsman estate, palanquin stopped. A man was standing near the palanquin and said, "Welcome, Lord Kale Henitus." Kale came out of the palanquin and looked at the house, and thought, the family that owns the lands at the entrance of the northeast, the Count Wilsman estate, they are neither a very rich nor a very strong family. In fact, they are quite average. That's why in the northeast, where there were no dukies or grand dukies, they could become very close with the Henitus, who were also counts. As the Henitus see it, it's better to be close with the Wilsman, as they are close to the capital, unlike themselves who were stuck in our outskirts. He said, Eric Wilsman. He remembered about the Hans word when he advised him. Hans told him that despite being comfortable with Lord Eric, maybe you should not be too relaxed around him, as there will be other young nobles at the meeting. Kale was following the Eric and thought, I can tell Eric and Kale are pretty close from the way Hans talked about them, but the report described Eric as an honest and even strict fellow than a lout. They stopped at the door and Eric asked, "Would you like to go in, Lord Kale?" He replied, "Sure," and thought worriedly, how should I behave when I meet them? But it turned out that I didn't need to worry about this at all. He opened the door and went in. A boy called his name. Kale looked at him. They were totally for sitting around the table with foodstuffs. A man wearing glasses and have gray hair, a girl and a boy with black hairs and eyes and wearing black shirt. The boy wearing glasses asked, "You used to listen to me, right?" He put his hand in his face and said again, "I'm sure you find all of this very tedious." Girl also said, "That's right, Lord Kale, I also heard you hated all the formalities." Man in black shirt said, "Lord Kale, it's not your fault that you don't like these." Man with glasses stand up from his seat and said, "Yeah, that's right, so you don't need to talk or even smile, just stay put. Just stay put and we will take care of everything. You hate tedious things and being unnecessarily formal." Kale looked them confusingly and have no word to say and thought, "This is strange." Kale thought, "This is strange," and said, "Staying put is what I do best." Man with glasses said confusingly, "What?" But then he smiled and said again, "That's right, you good at that." Eric's a meticulous and very normal character, but he's also worrywart. That did not mean he was timid either, and that's the paradox. I am sure the others from the northeast will get on your nerves. The one that follow Marquis Sten or other dukies won't be able to focus on anything else. But if you stay put, we will take care of all of it. How's that? Kale thought, I suppose Eric was worried about this the most. Out of the 10 most powerful families in the northeast, only these 4 families, including the Henitus, have not formed alliances with anyone. Those who have sworn allegiance together, nobles, would want to hand this entire group to all their higher-ups. That's why I should be more careful. These 4 families need to stay neutral. which means the Henitus, the strongest neutral power in the richest family, should not go around making trouble. Kale replied him with smile, sure, I'd like that. Man in glasses said again, we are thinking the four of us should go together as a group when we greet the crown prince. I am sure you did like to also skip this and just drink right away, but that might be a bit tough, so if you just greet the crown prince, we will take care of the rest, and gave him a glass of wine. Kale take the glass and raised it. They all raised their glasses and take a sip. Kale said, sounds good. Glasses man said, right? All you will have to do is just to sit there. Kale smiled and said, I can do that, and thought, this is the best offer, this is exactly what I want. Kale said, the wine from the Henitus estate sure is the best. At Kale house. Kale was sitting in the room. Choi Han opened the door and come in and said, Lord Kale, did you call for me? Kale asked, how are things at the inn? Choi Han replied, I checked on them, luckily enough, the kids seemed energetic. Kale asked again, so there's nothing left to do? He replied, yes sir, I suppose to. Kale stand up and told, I am going to lie down now, so tell Hans to stop standing by the door and go to bed too. He went near the window. Choi Han asked, are we going outside? He replied, yes, I have left the terrace window open like last time, so come to my room. Choi Han asked confusingly, without On or Hong. Will it be just the two of us? Dragon came from the window and said, I am going to. They both looked at the dragon and Kale said, it's just the three of us. Choi Han looked at the dragon and said confusingly, are we on our way to destroy everything? He replied, no, definitely not. Make your trip short and put on a hat when you come back. Kale waved his hand and thought, why would he think that far? Choi Han replied, yes sir. Kale sit on the bed. Dragon was laying on the metric and Choi Han walking towards the outside and opened the door and went out. Kale was laying in the bed and his eyes was closed. Dragon comes near to him and said in his ear, you can't really fall asleep. Kale thought, do I look like a 4-year-old to him? He get up, a voice comes from the window and he looked at the window. Choi Han stepped in the terrace. Kale said, Yuri hair, I guess a robe is better than a hat. Kale put hat in his head. Choi Han asked Dragon, are you going to follow us like that? He replied, I'm going to make myself invisible. Choi Han said, I hate dragons can polymorph themselves, cannot you turn into a human? That's might be easier. Dragon replied rudely, I don't like humans, I don't want to look like one, I was told that dragons are proud and cool. Choi Han asked confusingly, who told you that? Dragon stared Kale. Kale said, dragons are cool. Choi Han replied, you're right. Dragon used magic and make him invisible. They were standing in the window. Choi Han called him. Kale said, what is it? Choi Han asked, do I have to carry you? Kale raised his hand and point and he starting floating in the air. Kale smiled happily and said, dragons are great. Dragon was flying above of him and replied, that's right, I am great. They both become invisible. Choi Han looked this shockingly and said, dragon are really great.